Welcome to the Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. I'm your host, Peter Cepeda. On today's episode, we have the California missions, the Chinese immigration, and mining in California. When we think of the American history of the West, we mostly think of the English-speaking people's quest of moving westward, bringing civilization and industrialization. We often don't acknowledge other people who ventured into the vast western regions of North America. The achievements of other explorers and settlers often only exist in the names. We see this with the French names like Boise and Grand Tetons. We see that western states like California and Nevada were given Spanish names, yet the people who name them get little recognition. Non-English speaking Europeans had already gone west. We can even see their activity today, especially in the missions of California. Today, you can go to California and see the many missions. It is amazing that some of these missions were established before the time the U.S. had declared its independence. Others were established when America was gaining their independence. Recently, some members of my family visited some of these missions. I have a picture of my 8-year-old nephew standing in robes that almost fit perfect for him. My family had also visited the mission of San Carlos, where Saint Junipero Serra was buried. These missions stand today, a testament to the achievements of a forgotten chapter in America's history of the West. They number 21 in total. These buildings were often white walls and red tile roofs. The chapels are very narrow compared to other churches. This is due to the friars not understanding trussing. One such mission, San Antonio de Padua, resembles another mission, the Alamo in Texas, particularly the front of the mission, which shares the same shape as the mission in Texas. The mission also features a courtyard. This courtyard is rather plain, housing rocks and ornamental grasses due to the lack of water. Simplicity is a theme in the California missions. The missions of California are not as ornate as the ones of Arizona and Texas. In those missions, you see the decorations typically found in Spanish Baroque and the ornamentation passed down by the Moors. This simplicity of the missions reflects the poverty of the Franciscans who made them. Or it may be because California was harder to access from Mexico. San Carlos Carmel mission has 2 short bell towers. One features a dome. This mission is also the site where Junipero Serra erected a wooden cross. The cross which stands today is a replica. No one was maybe as important to understanding the missions as Junipero Serra. He had built 9 missions and is credited for 5,880 converts. This estimate comes from a history of Junipero Serra written by Friar Francisco Palo, written in 1787. In this book, he writes about Junipero Serra like he was a juniper who gave shade over his companions. Fitting, since Junipero means juniper in Spanish. In this document, you will find that the California is referred to as a peninsula. This is interesting since California used to be thought as an island. He also writes of the natives, describing them as barbarians. It was not that the Indians of California were violent, they were actually peaceful. What shocked the Spanish was that they were naked. living a lifestyle similar to the Bushmen of Africa. Despite the controversy surrounding Junipero Serra, nearly every historian credits Serra for defending the Indians from the cruelty of the conquistadors. Junipero Serra even traveled to Mexico City on foot to petition for better treatment of the natives. He did this journey on foot with a swollen leg. He had ever since suffering from a snake bite. It is also important to note that when the Indians did flee the missions, they fled mostly to the cities where there was drink. Junipero Serra was canonized in 2015. Even though Serra was a champion for the Indians, he is disrespected. Statues of the great man have been defaced in 2015. Someone decapitated a statue of him in Monterrey. Just one instance of a long series of vandalization. Here we have a tale of two types of peoples. One is brave enough to walk 2,000 miles on behalf of the downtrodden, and the other so cowardly that they destroy statues of a man that are no longer present on Earth. Very few people actually want to go in depth. All that people want to know about Serra is that he was a colonizer, but they don't explain that 18th century Spanish colonization entailed. This entailed not retaliating after the Indians burnt the first mission of San Diego. This was a different colonization in the 16th century, and Spanish civil colonization is very different from the English colonization. Later Spanish colonization in North America was more focused on missions, more so than English colonization. The Spanish monarchy would even support friars over the conquistadors. The natives were seen as Spanish subjects. The English did not see natives the same way. It may be true that Spain did not always live up to their standards, but they had standards that allowed for assimilation. When we talk about the California missions, we are talking about later missions, even though many of these missions were built before America had declared independence. There were some built in Arizona and New Mexico before. These missions are credited to another remarkable man like Junipero Serra, Eusebi Kino, a Jesuit, where Serra was a Franciscan, born in Tyrol, a border region between Italy and the German-speaking Austria. It is believed that he wanted to travel to China, and that's where the name Kino came from. But it's also debated that his real name was the German name Kuhn, but it was changed to Kino to Italianize it. Not only is the origins of his name interesting, but so was what he did in northern Mexico and the southwest United States. He had established missions amongst the Pimas Indians. In March of 1695, the Pimas destroyed the homes and killed his fellow missionaries. This was a problem for Kino, not just because he was in danger, but because his previous conclusions that the Pimas were not allies with the warring Apaches were possibly wrong. He had previously been denounced in Mexico for not indicating whether the Pimas were indeed allies with the Apache. Kino waited for his death when the revolt spread to the missions, but the revolt never came to him. The revolt was quickly crushed by the Spanish soldiers. The Pimas sued for peace, and the missionaries pardoned them. Kino would eventually be proven right that there was no alliance between the Pimas and the Apache because the Indians displayed their Apache scalps. Kino inherited a horrible situation when it came to the conversion of the natives. After the events of the spring of 1695, Kino went to Mexico City and told of the cruelty of the Spanish before and after the revolt. One such claim was that 3 Pimas with meat were put to death for cattle rustling. Later it was discovered that the meat they were carrying was venison and not beef. He also went against and reversed the stupid policy of forcing the converts to work where the unconverted Indians were free to go about the Spanish settlements. Before Serra traveled to Mexico City to protest the treatment of the natives, Kino would also travel to that city before him. Kino would influence the missions of California in other ways. English pirates such as Francis Drake were now threatening Spanish holdings in the Pacific. California was at a serious threat. Although the Spanish claimed the land, there was no settlements or any way to protect California from the English. This prompted Kino to make an expedition north, along the Colorado River, to find its mouth and a clear path to California. Kino rode on horseback, guided by Indians, at the age of 67. It was thought that California was the largest island in the world, but when Kino reached the mouth of the river, it was discovered that California was in fact a peninsula. He mapped the region, creating the first accurate map of the area. The development of California missions may have been very different or may not have happened without him. Father Kino became known as the Padre on horseback. He became very familiar with horses. He would ride to various missions in the Sonora and Arizona. At one time, he raced across the country to stop an execution of an Indian. He also introduced cattle to the Southwest. He raised them to feed his missions. No wonder why Kino is in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. The people like Kino and Serra led to the development of the West more than almost anyone else did. They built the first buildings where the U.S. was gaining independence. They converted the natives. They mapped the unknown regions. It was the Spanish missions that brought horses, sheep, and cows to the land, which would become valuable to the cowboys of the Southwest U.S. The picture of the West is hard to imagine without them, since they have brought so much into the development of the West, yet they get so little recognition.
Thank you, Peter, for your insights into the Spanish missions of the West. Now for something a little different, as I would like to speak of Western migration, as everyone should be aware that American history is a story of Westward migration. Since Americans first landed upon the shores of North America, they have found reasons for leaving home and traveling west. The search for a new place, whether for wealth or freedom, is a part of our shared national identity. Even though Western migration is an important part of U.S. history, many people are only aware of it through fictional accounts in film. Histories in film are often only partially correct or completely false. The account told today is from the journal of Stephen Chapman David. Stephen was born February 16, 1833, in Massachusetts, but his family quickly moved to Nashua, New Hampshire. While in Nashua, he would hold a variety of jobs ranging from being a worker in a textile mill to being a cabin boy on a ship. In the early 1850s, Stephen would eventually turn his gaze west and travel multiple times to California and back by boat, with a short walk across the Isthmus of Panama. Stephen would later travel to Europe in 1854 to ply his merchant trade, but would die in 1856, having led a full life and leaving a fascinating journal. His account provides a first-hand view of what it was like to take part in the journey into the gold fields in search of opportunity. In July 1850, Stephen and his brother Josiah left New York with California as their goal. The newspapers at the time were telling everyone far and wide that gold had been discovered in Sutter's Mill in California. This caused a gold rush which lasted from the tail end of the 1840s and through much of the 1850s. There were two main routes to California, overland or by boat. In 1849, 25,000 to 30,000 gold seekers traveled by land and 40,000 traveled by boat. The brothers chose to risk the dangers of an ocean voyage. They sailed down the coast of the United States and then traversed the Isthmus of Panama before progressing up the west coast of California. The trip to Panama was not easy or convenient for Stephen. A storm threatened to sink the ship. The ship began to fill with water. Those aboard bailed the ship, and thanks to their efforts, it was saved, even though the winds and waves had done great damage. The rest of the journey was relatively easy, and Stephen was able to sell some New York newspapers that he had brought on the trip. He also managed to find some employment at a newspaper printing office, which would help him pass his time during his stay in Panama. This turned out to be well timed, as the bane of all travelers occurred when the luggage did not arrive on time. Stephen had to wait for the luggage while his brother went on without him to get a head start in California. The stay in Panama was short-lived, however, and Stephen was able to board a ship headed north toward the gold fields. While staying along the Mexican coast, another danger of the time reared its ugly head: cholera. Fortunately, Stephen was not harmed and arrived in San Francisco on September 4th. Another modern misconception is that everyone who went to California for the gold rush took a mining claim. While there is some truth to that, there was a variety of work to be done, as Stephen quickly learns when he arrives to find his brother employed as a carpenter, making $5 a day. During the gold rush, buildings were in constant need of repair. Not only were many buildings poorly constructed, but fires also often destroyed sections of the towns. Stephen, however, did not follow his brother's path. Instead, he continued to sell the newspapers from New York that he had brought on his journey and newspapers he purchased in San Francisco. Eventually, both brothers tried their hands at mining, but the reality of mining did not live up to the fantasy. Stephen writes in his journal that they started to prospect a certain flat nearby that was supposed to be rich, but after a hard afternoon's work, were doomed to be totally disappointed in this, our first experience in mining. What they saw in the pan was a wake-up call to the difficulty of the work. The weather was scalding hot, and as Stephen wrote, "We find it no easy task to ply the pick and bend over the pan." The brothers' fortunes turned around quickly. After meeting an acquaintance from their trip to California, they purchased a supply store that increased their ability to get ahead on more than the strength of their backs. At this point, Stephen records an activity that might surprise many 21st century readers, as the brothers' first task was to sew a tent for their store. This enabled them to quickly be up and operating. Now the brothers had another way of making money. Stephen operated the store while Josiah continued the quest for gold. This is not enough for Stephen. He decides to branch out into the mail system, bringing miners' mail from the mining camps to San Francisco. This not only turned a profit, but also paid for the trip into San Francisco, which enabled Stephen to buy cheaper supplies for the store. While mail delivery may now seem like such a small thing, it was important to the miners. As Stephen wrote that upon his return, the miners dropped their tools and run to meet me in haste to get the letters from their dear friends at home. And those who are so unfortunate as to receive no letters frequently rate their friends at home most severely for neglecting so important a duty. And as they look upon their fellow miners who are more fortunate, reading epistles of friendship and consistency penned in the fine hand of a female, frequently a tear comes and bends the eye, while the heart grieves at being thus forgotten by loved ones at home. But sometimes the letter bears a black seal, and I have seen the recipient of such a missive convulsively grasping a lock of hair it bore. uttering lamentations as sobbing as only one can when he has lost one whose affection and happiness were closely entwined and almost inseparable with his own. It is apparent by their action of the miners that they were not unfeeling or disconnected from those who they had left behind. Black seals signified a death in the family, and in an era before widespread photography, a lock of hair served as a reminder of the loved ones. Miners were deeply affected by the choices that they made for themselves and their distance from loved ones. As if life was not hard enough, there were also cases of robbery, not of bank or stagecoaches, but rather the theft of a pick or a person's savings. Stephen does not report any vigilante justice in his journal. Instead, when people learned of these crimes, the perpetrators were allowed to go on their way with a warning. This may not have always been the case, but it shows that people of this time and place don't fit the popular image of the Old West. Stephen and Josiah decided to leave California and try their luck in mining in Oregon. Again, Josiah moved first, to be followed by Stephen. They sold the store in preparation to move. After sailing to Portland, Oregon, Stephen found his brother disillusioned with mining in Oregon and wished to return to California. However, on their return to California, they decided that they had been gone from New York long enough and it was time to go home. The trip was largely uneventful until they arrived on the Caribbean side of the Isthmus, where the brothers became involved in an uprising of blacks against whites. Those who were traveling became stuck while waiting for transport. After the uprising was quelled, they were able to get transport and be on their way. Once they made it home, Josiah became a farmer, but Stephen returned to California. After arriving in San Francisco, Stephen set about settling his accounts and started to once again to engage in commerce. In his travels, Stephen wrote about encountering a site that is an excellent example of what drove people into the West and filled their imaginations. As we arrived in sight of Page's Ranch, which is situated in a valley surrounded by towering hills, while a clear, limpid brook gurgled along through the park-like grounds by the house and was soon lost in the forest beyond. While surveying the scene and drinking in the loveliness of the landscape with my wondering eyes, I thought it a paradise on earth, as the very place my imagination had pictured to me in younger days, as the realization of all the airy castles I had built in my romantic spells, where I would live and die, away from the selfish, wicked world, in some retired spot, some lovely dell, where nature has lavished all her charms, where the air is filled with the perfume of 1,000 flowers, and where the sweet warblings of multitudes of beautiful feathered songsters combine to make it a residence more suitable for angels than for men. Stephen, however, does not linger here, even with the beauty before him. He goes about his business of buying and selling newspapers and books. Contrary to popular misconceptions of Westerners, his wares were well received in the mining camps. At this point, the business did well enough that he was able to invest in several different mines, build a new house, and enjoy the fruits of his labor. In the West, change came quickly, and for Stephen it was no different. He received word from his family that his brother was sick, and shortly after he learned of his brother's death. This was to be the end of his time in the West, as he remarked that when he heard of his brother Josiah's death, which came upon me so sudden and afflicting, that I desired to be with my friends and kindred, and not be a wonder in this cold and wicked world. In the same way that Stephen Chapman David left the West for home, so does the reader leave his story and return to the modern world with a certain amount of sadness, but also a more complete vision of what the West was like at this time. The West allowed opportunities to those who were willing to risk their lives to attain what it offered.
Thank you for that story, Jeff. From an account of white prospectors going to California, we move on to Chinese immigrants looking to do the same. When people think of Chinese immigration to the United States in the 1800s, the two most common things that typically come to mind are settling in California and building the Transcontinental Railroad. While those certainly are significant parts of history, they are not the only things that the Chinese did in the American West. Chinese immigrants traveled and settled wherever work could be found, and tried to carve out their own communities and opportunities wherever they could. Their presence in the West is frequently ignored, if not outright rejected, and their part in history has been largely forgotten. But in places such as Idaho, they were key to making the state as prosperous as it was. During the mid-19th century, China was in dire straits. The Qing dynasty was struggling to deal with internal and external pressures. Foreign nations like Great Britain were interfering in Chinese politics and markets. Racial, religious, and political tensions were high. The country was suffering from famines, and the Taiping Rebellion between 1850 and 1864 left millions dead or destitute. However, people found options. News coming from across the Pacific reported that gold was being found in California, and that everyone was making a fortune. Chinese men took the chance and sailed to San Francisco in hopes of getting the money they needed to survive at home. Besides mining for gold, the Chinese found other job opportunities. White labor organizers were happy to discover that Chinese laborers would work jobs white workers would not, with more effort and for less money. Labor companies began advertising directly to the Chinese immigrants and focused on them specifically as their target demographic. In his book, Frontier History Along Idaho's Clearwater River, John Bradbury gives this example of one such advertisement from Hong Kong in the early 1860s. Americans are very rich people. They want the Chinaman to come and make him very welcome. There you will have great pay, large houses, and food and clothing of the finest description. You can write to your friends, or send them money at any time, and we will be responsible for the safe delivery. It is a nice country, without mandarins or soldiers. All alike, big man, no larger than little man. Money is in great plenty and to spare in America. Such as wish to have wages and labor guaranteed can obtain the surety by application at this office. When word got back to China about these employment opportunities, migration increased substantially. Eventually, the Chinese in San Francisco formed large and distinct communities, managed by an association of Chinese merchants called the Six Companies. The Six Companies helped Chinese migrants find work and places to live. However, what set them apart from other immigrants was that they came to the United States specifically for jobs, not to settle down. Their stay in this foreign land was temporary, and they fully expected to return home when all was said and done. When work started to dry up and anti-Chinese sentiments grew stronger in California, they moved on, looking for other places where they could earn money and goods to send home. For many, that place was the Idaho Territory. The region at that time was largely unmapped and barely surveyed. It's a region of vast arid deserts, rocky hills, and deep river canyons. Traveling through the area was so difficult that most people did not stay long enough to learn the geography. In fact, as Ronald James describes it in his book Ruins of a World, the Snake River Canyon area was so remote and so little known that the General Land Office map of Idaho for 1871 misplaced the Shoshone Falls, placing them below the confluence of the Snake River and Rock Creek, when in fact they are located approximately 8 miles above and east of the mouth of Rock Creek. The unknown factor, people gradually settled down and found work. Gold was discovered in the territory in the early 1860s, and placer mines were quickly established. However, the gold in these mines became increasingly difficult to acquire, so most white miners moved on to easier targets, giving the Chinese an opportunity to move in. At first, there was moderate resistance to their arrival, but after the Orofino district invited the Chinese in to work on deserted claims, other mining settlements followed suit. According to Leonard J. Arrington's History of Idaho, Volume 1, within the next 3 years, Chinese appeared in every mining district in northern Idaho, with as many as 2,000 in the region. Bradbury reports that, by 1870, 6 out of 10 miners in all of Idaho Territory and 8 out of 10 inhabitants in Pierce City were Chinese. The sizable population of Chinese people in the Idaho Territory transformed the culture and economics of the region. Chinese mines pumped gold into the economy that otherwise wouldn't have been found. They grew large vegetable gardens and raised pigs instead of cows. They operated laundries and saloons, and carried useful goods in their general stores that were hard to come by in white-owned businesses. Additionally, because the Chinese population equaled or outnumbered white settlers, they were treated more as equals, and were able to form stronger senses of unity and community. That strong sense of unity and community also allowed them to fight back against targeted crimes and oppression. They made full use of the court system to defend themselves and their property. And if that failed, then they had no qualms about taking the law into their own hands. According to the documentary Gold Mountain Dreams, frontier justice, Chinese style, included late-night arson or a delivery of firewood to an enemy, each log filled with gunpowder. Not all Chinese people who moved to the United States came of their own free will. The state of China was so bad that many families sold their children to merchants and raiders in hopes of getting food, money, or protection from attacks. In the United States, Chinese women were a rare and prized commodity, and as a result, many women were shipped across the oceans to America to work as prostitutes or other forms of servitude. One such girl was La Luna Toy, better known as Polly Bemis. According to Sister Mary Elphinstone's account of Polly's life, she was born in 1853 in northern China near the Mongolian border. She was traded to brigands in exchange for food, and then sold to an outfit that shipped female slaves to the United States. She was 18 when she arrived in San Francisco. After arriving in America, she was sent up to Portland and bought by a Chinese merchant by the name of Hong King for $2,500. They then moved to Warrens, Idaho when she was 19. Hong King used her as his cook and as a dancing girl for his saloon. Next door to King's saloon was the business of a local merchant named Charlie Bemis. Polly cleaned Bemis's place, and in return, he helped her out whenever she was in trouble. Elphinstone writes, when things got too rough in Hong King's dance hall, Polly used to fly out the back and into Bemis's back door, and he never failed her. His quiet, stern personality, together with his shooting ability, saved Polly from several very threatening situations. At some point, Bemis won ownership of Polly from Hong King in a game of poker. He had her run his boarding house and sell gold trinkets. They later married in 1894, and Polly received her certificate of residence for a Chinese laborer in 1896. For the first time in 23 years, she was a free person. They moved to a property on the Salmon River and ran a small business selling food and ferrying travelers across the river. Polly was treated as a special attraction by the local river guide, Captain Gulicki. He would stop by their place so his clients could meet her. Such guests included Sissy Patterson, the owner of the Washington Times-Herald, and a princess of Norway. Elphinstone writes that Mrs. Patterson spoke for Polly's quality and indicated that she was enchanted with her. 5 feet tall, she is brown and wrinkled as a nut, she wrote, and at 69 full of dash and charm. Polly passed away on November 6, 1933 at the age of 80. She was buried in Grangeville, and her possessions are on display at the St. Gertrude's Museum in Cottonwood. To this day, she is remembered in the region as someone who overcame extreme hardships and was beloved by all who met her. Despite all their hard work and large community, the Chinese in Idaho were rarely treated well by their white neighbors. They were frequently abused and called slurs. Many mining communities excluded them from newer or more profitable dig sites. The Idaho territorial government imposed a head tax of $5, about equivalent to approximately $100 in 2022, on every Chinese worker in the territory. Bradbury writes about the account of a Joseph Boyd, whose job was to collect the tax between 1868 and 1869. When he would go down to a claim, the Chinese would run into the woods and hide, and his job was to round them up and extract the tax. If they pleaded poverty, he would march them down in pigtail file down the trail to the store, where they would borrow the required sum from the storekeeper. Money was easily made, quickly spent, and lightly valued, unless, of course, you were Chinese and only had a Chinaman's chance. Violence was an easy way for white people to push back against the yellow peril of the Chinese. Arrington mentions an incident in his book where 5 Chinese men were killed by vigilantes. According to Arrington, in the fall of 1885, a hatchet murder occurred in Pierce City. Suspicions fell on Li Qi Nam. A white vigilante community seized Li, his business partner, and 3 other Chinese. When the local deputy and his small posse rode out with the prisoners, they were intercepted by a lynching party that improvised a gallows and hung the Chinese from a pole lashed between 2 pine trees. A subsequent investigation by Governor Edward A. Stevenson determined that the only action taken by the local citizens seemed appropriate and that the Chinese hanged were probably the ones that committed the murder. Other deadly attacks on the Chinese include a massacre at Rock Springs that killed 28 and another in Hell's Canyon that killed 31. The U.S. government did little to stem the wave of anti-Chinese sentiments. In 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented any further immigration and denied citizenship to any Chinese people and their children in the country, regardless of how long they had been there. Territorial governments also made it illegal for Chinese people to own property and to testify against whites in court. Gradually, through the rest of the 19th century, the Chinese left Idaho. Ronald James discusses some of these factors towards their departure in Ruins of a World. He says, in addition to the anti-Chinese policies, the closing of the frontier, advancements made in mining technology, and the completion of the larger railroad projects of the time left thousands unemployed. Many Chinese moved to larger coastal cities like San Francisco, New York, and Boston, where there were already established Chinese communities and more economic security. Others went back home to China with what they had, unable to get much more from the United States but frosty receptions and threats of harm. The Chinese people that came to the United States, and more specifically to Idaho, took a massive risk. As Charlie Chin put it in Gold Mountain Dreams, I think the most remarkable thing is just the pure courage that these men had to go to places unseen and unknown, unmapped. If they were going to Idaho or Montana, they had no real idea how far it was. They took up jobs that others refused to take, dug in mining spots that white miners gave up on, worked harder than other laborers for less pay, all to support their families back home where they were enduring even worse hardships. They were strangers in a strange land, and they tried their hardest to make the most of the situation in the face of growing hostility. Much of the work they did has faded from recognition, but the impact they made on the American West can still be found if one knows where to look for it. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about people's journeys to California and what they found there. Until next time, this has been The Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College.
Welcome to The Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. I'm your host, Megan Garrison. On today's episode, we have Squabbles of the American West, stories of Mormons and land rights, fights for freedom, military miscommunication, and their impacts on the American West in the late 1850s. It is time to talk about some squabbles that occurred in the American West in the 1850s. My name is Megan, and in this episode, Chloe, Ben, and I will be talking about some of the wars that happened during this time period. I know you can't see me, but I used air quotes around wars, because, well, these aren't what you might think of when you think of a war, and you'll soon see why. The first event in the episode is known as the Border War, or Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is essentially a precursor for the Civil War, which was responsible for some of the bloodiest and deadliest battles in United States history. The war was caused over slavery, which also caused Bleeding Kansas. Alright, so I'll first discuss what was Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, also known as the Border War, was a series of very violent civil confrontations in the Kansas Territory between 1854 and 1859. Why were these confrontations occurring, you might be wondering? Well, it all began in 1854 when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would allow Nebraska and Kansas territories to choose whether or whether not to allow slavery when they joined the Union. This was known as popular sovereignty because the citizens of the territory got to vote because Kansas was on the border of Missouri, which was a slave state at the time. Kansas then became basically a battleground for the people who were pro-slavery and the people that were anti-slavery. Oh, and why wasn't Nebraska affected this way? Well, Nebraska was farther north. They were assumed to be anti-slavery, so that left the Kansas Territory to suffer the consequences of this act. After this act was passed, things heated up in the Kansas Territory. All hell was about to break loose. In March of 1855, the first legislative elections took place. Both pro- and anti-slavery sides sent voters, many from outside the territory. The North sent voters to ensure the state would be free, but the South, especially Missouri, sent their pro-slavery voters who used intimidation and illegal voting to try and scare off all of the other voters. Well, the president at the time, President Pierce, decided that having a pro-slavery legislation would be the only legitimate form of government in the new Kansas Territory. And, yes, you can already guess, it's going to get even worse. This decision just made the anti-slavery voters even more angry. They even had their own political rallying song. Said the lyrics, "Far in the west rolls the thunder, the tumult of battle is raging. Where bleeding Kansas is raging, warfare with slavery. Struggling with foes who surround her, lo, she implores you to stay her. Will you to slavery betray her? Never. She shall be free. Hurrah. Swear that you'll never betray her. Kansas shall be free." This was printed in the New York Daily newspaper in March of 1856. By early 1856, the violent outbreaks were starting, and things for everybody were just getting worse. The first big event, the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, started in May of 1856. Now, you may have heard of a man named John Brown. John Brown is often remembered for his raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859, but he was also involved with the violence that resulted from the sacking of Lawrence. A group of pro-slavery Southerners marched into the free area of Lawrence, where they looted and destroyed property, and they even lit a hotel on fire. People all over the North were appalled, and newspapers were filled with the stories of this event, calling it a stab to their freedom. This blow to the anti-slavery stronghold caused anti-slavery supporters like John Brown to retaliate. Brown was an abolitionist, a person against slavery, who was very involved in the Kansas Territory. He was fed up with pro-slavery raiders coming through and causing chaos. So, he took the matters into his own hands. 3 days after the sacking, Brown gathered 4 of his sons and 3 other men to confront the pro-slavery groups. Well, when they got to the Potawatomi Valley, where these people had resided, Brown, his sons, and 3 other men dragged 3 pro-slavery raid members out of their homes and murdered them. And if I may add, they murdered them brutally. John Brown didn't stop there. He just kept on going. Talk about a dedication to what you believe. In July of 1856, more pro-slavery forces showed up to shut down a meeting that was being held in Topeka about free state rights. As you might guess, this got ugly. John Brown retaliated once again. He, along with a group of other abolitionists who were his supporters, led 2 other large, violent attacks. What is so interesting about this is that a large majority of the people who resided in the Kansas Territory weren't really that invested in the conflict over slavery. Poor farmers in the area who were categorized as pro-slavery often just wanted to feed their families and didn't actually even own slaves. Other people who were labeled anti-slavery weren't even doing anything to help the people of color or advocate for their rights at all. The violence was just mainly between the 2 radical sides on the spectrum of the issues in Kansas. In 1857, there was a constitutional convention in Lecompton, Kansas, to propose the Lecompton Constitution, which was a pro-slavery document deeming that the Kansas Territory would be a slave state. Free staters, as they were called, boycotted the event, as they were upset that many fraudulent votes had been cast for this constitution. Well, the president at the time, President Buchanan, was going to have Congress push to pass the Constitution, but there was a disagreement by the people in Congress, such as Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. Because nobody was getting anywhere and disagreements kept happening, they decided to push the votes one more time for the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas in 1858. This time, the Free Staters decided to vote, and guess what happened? The Constitution was rejected, but there was still more to come. This isn't the end of the story. The Lecompton Constitution was rejected, but violence waged on. There were more violent attacks in 1858 and 1859 by Free Staters and the people who were pro-slavery. Then, in 1859, the man of the hour, John Brown, led a raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the purpose of liberating a group of enslaved people. In the end, the raid failed. Brown was executed, which made him a martyr to the cause of freeing the slaves. There were still issues with the Kansas state constitutions in Congress. Things also were heated in the Illinois Senate race. Abraham Lincoln spent this race trying to take Senator Douglas's seat. Though unsuccessful, Lincoln would go on to win a series of debates with Douglas over the issue of slavery. This revived his political career, getting him a presidential nomination for the Republican Party in 1860. The debate between pro-slavery and the anti-slavery groups in Kansas would remain an issue until Kansas joined the Union in 1861. If you think the issue is over, it's definitely not. The Civil War would begin a few months later. Now, I will hand it over to Chloe to talk about another war in the American West, the Utah War.
Thank you, Megan, for the awesome introduction and your insightful overview of Bleeding Kansas and its impacts. Welcome, listeners. I'm Chloe. Today, I'm going to tell you about an event that occurred around the same time as Bleeding Kansas, the Utah War. It's also referred to as the Utah Expedition, Utah Campaign, Buchanan's Blunder, or the Mormon War. Why there are so many names to such a short event? I'd tell you if I knew. We begin our story in 1857. Bleeding Kansas is ongoing. The Mexican War had ended 7 years earlier, and the Civil War is still in the dim future. Though the Utah War was insanely short, it still generated so much national attention and still provides rich insight on the tensions between religious organizations and the U.S. government, which seems to be a reoccurring theme in American relational struggles. This historical event begins with the Mormon community's persecution in the East for their beliefs and practices. This drove them to migrate to the West and settle in Utah, where the war takes place. The Mormons had many goals and motivations that drove them to create the strong community that they were, and often still are today. Part of the Compromise of 1850, Senator Henry Clay introduced the Utah Territorial Bill, which established a territorial government. So Utah was a territory by September 9, 1850, migrated there. The Mormon community quickly grew. They were a hardworking group and extremely close-knit, frequently helping their neighbors whether or not they were members of the congregation. Mormon leader Brigham Young was appointed as the first territorial governor. He had worked closely with Joseph Smith, who was the original founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, established in 1830. He became the second president of the Latter-day Saint Church. Brigham Young was greatly responsible for shaping the American West. He led the Latter-day Saints to Utah and was popularly known as the Mormon Moses or American Moses, and the people revered him as a prophet. He was a serious-looking man with dark shoulder-length hair that he often wore brushed back and neat. As governor, he created multiple programs to construct, including roads, bridges, forts, irrigation ditches, public welfare programs, and more. He served a major role in establishing settlements in Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, Idaho, northern Mexico, and of course Utah. It is often noted that Brigham Young had a gift for speech and could light a fire in people with his words and his passion. His vision was responsible for the building of more temples than any other Mormon leader in that community. Everyone was living happily until the community began to draw government's attention. You see, there were certain Mormon values and traditions that were not necessarily aligned with the ideology that America was striving to establish as a new country of power and integrity. The Mormon religion at that time had ties to things such as polygamy and slavery, which some politicians in the U.S. saw as, quote, twin relics of barbarianism. So when President James Buchanan was inaugurated on March 4, 1857, he moved rather quickly to control this growing force. Buchanan wanted to replace Young with an outsider, someone who was not a member of the church. This may not seem like a big enough deal to start a war over, but we have to keep in mind the tight-knit connections of this community and the history of the persecution they suffered. The Mormon religion makes it a point to be set apart from people who aren't members. Their temples, for example, are not open to general public, except for cases of open houses and rededication ceremonies. But the U.S. government wanted someone on their side who would work with them to grow America in their vision. Alfred Cumming was appointed to take Young's place. Cumming was from a distinguished family and was widely experienced in Western political and business affairs. He was a larger man with short white hair and no desire for violence. His goal was to occupy his position with dignity and fairness. The Mormon community saw the integration of a new governor as an immediate threat, as territorial governors were appointed by the president. They assumed that this was an act of persecution. In the government's eyes, it was an attempt to bring the Mormons into a more conventional relationship with the nation, at a time when national and territorial tensions were high and conflict over slavery were becoming an issue of states' rights versus centralized national authority. Buchanan's choice ultimately created bitterness and misunderstanding. Once the Mormons caught wind that the Utah Territory's new governor was traveling under militia escort, they assumed the worst. Young rallied their militia, known as the Nauvoo Legion, and the community made preparations for defense. It's crazy to think about this today, and what a phone call could have prevented during this time. This event largely happened because of a big miscommunication between two powers. Neither wanted this war. The fear of an uprising and the fear of persecution were so high that everyone felt threatened. For a whole year, tensions remained. The Nauvoo Legion had some cunning tactics. Instead of fighting head-on, which would ultimately result in a massacre with unnecessary bloodshed on the Mormon side, the Legion decided to try and weaken the U.S. military instead. I'm sure that they probably knew that against the militia they had little chance of victory, and even if they had one, what then? I don't know the minds of those involved, but I can assume their main goal was not to run a country or deal with those affairs. The Legion felled trees in the U.S. military's path, stampeded animals, and even stole or destroyed their food rations. In a journal entry, a man named Tracy, a soldier in Johnson's army who was on that journey to Utah, actually mentioned the lack of food and clothing the soldiers had at their position because of the Legion's tactics. Tracy noted that their winter rations were running low because of the raids that had occurred. Quote, "The odor of old soup in the company kettles, made up, as it is, from the perfectly black and rotted beef of our November slaughter, and with no sign of seasoning, compelled me absolutely to turn aside my head." Now, we call this historical event a war, but in all honesty, there was never an actual battle between the U.S. military and the Mormons' militia. However, that doesn't mean that there was no bloodshed. On September 11, 1857, members of the Mormon community, most likely those from the Legion, were held on suspicion for a mass murder of Western migrants. Roughly 120 Californian-bound settlers, unarmed men, women, and children, were traveling together. They were from states like Arkansas and Missouri. They were killed in southwest Utah by a group of Utah Mormons. The full details of this brutal attack, known as the Mountain Meadow Massacre, are still unknown. When confronted about it, the Mormon community initially claimed that the migrants must have been killed by natives, but investigations proved otherwise. There was another incident about a month after Mountain Meadow on October in 1857, referred to as the Aiken Massacre. The Mormon militia arrested 6 Californians, once again travelers going through Utah. They charged them with being spies for the U.S. Army. The travelers were released, with obviously no evidence to keep them. However, soon after being released, these same individuals were murdered and robbed of their stock and $25,000. This mass murder cannot be directly connected to the Mormon militia, yet speculations were made accusing the Mormon militia of this massacre because of the previous one. Not much happened to those who committed the murders, except for John D. Lee, who was the leader of the local Mormon community and the local militia. He went on trial twice. Lee was convicted by a jury, sentenced to death, and executed in Utah by a firing squad on March 23, 1877. It's estimated that roughly 150 people died as a direct result of this war, which is actually very similar to the mortality rate of the 7-year-long struggle in Kansas that Megan described for us. There have been several remembrances of Mountain Meadow Massacre, including commemorative observations, the building of monuments and markers, and the creation of associations to help promote the massacre's history and ensure protection of the massacre site and grave sites. The first of these was founded in 1859 by Major James H. Carleton of the U.S. Army and his cavalry. They arrived with orders to bury the bones of the massacred victims, but while there, they decided to make a structure of loose granite and stone to form a mound as a memorial for those who had died there. It was 15 feet in circumference at the base, 12 feet in height, and supported a cross made from red cedar wood. On the cross, facing towards the north, was an inscription carved in the wood saying, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." And on a slab of granite was written, "Here 120 men, women, and children were massacred in cold blood early in September 1857. They are from Arkansas." Allegedly, a few years later, in 1861, during a tour of southern Utah, Brigham Young, along with some 60 other saints, visited the massacre site. After viewing the inscription on the cross, Wilford Woodruff, who was another religious leader of the LDS and soon to be 4th president of that church, recorded that President Young had stated, "It should be vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little." The cross was then torn down, and the rocks of the mount were dismantled, leaving little of the original marker. Tensions eventually began to die down, thanks to Cummings' eagerness to make peace. The government and Mormon community attempted to find common ground to stop this expensive and unnecessary conflict. The transfer of Utah's governorship from Church Brigham Young to non-Mormon member Alfred Cumming was finally confidently in motion. With such rebellion came consequences for Utah. The U.S. military planned to keep a presence in that area, but that was as short-lived as the war was. The Civil War began in the East, and troops were called to fight and prepare for what historical events were to come next. And that, my friends, is the experience of the Utah War. Now it's time to hear about our next Squabble of the West from our friend Ben.
Hey, I'm Ben Birdsell. I'm a secondary education history major, and my story also relates to Chloe's themes of government and military miscommunication and how they almost led to a national conflict. My conflict is often forgotten about and stands in the shadow of the American Civil War. My conflict is the Pig War. This conflict tells the story of two countries fighting over insignificant land, and the fun part of this conflict is that it started over the shooting of a single Berkshire pig all the way back in 1859. So for the next little while, I'm going to tell you about how the events of the Pig War of 1859 showed the extremes of manifest destiny, a series of conflicting egos, the prevailing of cooler heads, and ultimately, the power that one pig can hold in the hearts of many. To tell the story of the Pig War, we have to start all the way back with the Revolutionary War and its outcome. After the Americans won, USA, there was an agreement to expand the American colonies west to share the border with the French territory, which later on became the Louisiana Purchase. But one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, made a push to claim more northern parts of Canada. At the time, what we know today as Canada was actually known as British North America, but to make it easier for my understanding and yours, I'll just call it Canada. During these negotiations, Great Britain ended up hating the idea as most of their Canadian territory was already well established. The UK then rejected the idea, and with Canada off the table, there needed to be an agreement as to where the northern border of the new United States ended and where the Canadian border began. For the most part, there's plenty of agreements with rivers, lakes, and certain parallels, but west of the Great Lakes, there weren't many great contenders for where the border should have been drawn. The issue was, at this time, there wasn't great cartography. West of the former colonies and the border they agreed upon was geographically awful. For the most part, it was mostly built on general guesses of the area and was a compilation of local sources that proved to be unreliable. They ended up using the John Mitchell map, and to sum it up, the map said that there was a nice oval lake, and directly west of it, they could draw a line along a parallel until it met the Mississippi River. The two sides agreed on this arbitrary and inaccurate line and called it a day. There was a major issue, though, and it was that the lake wasn't oval-shaped in any capacity, and the Mississippi River was well over a couple hundred miles south of where they thought it was. So the map ended up being nearly useless when decades later it was updated, and the lake and the Mississippi River were several hundred miles apart. Not knowing this at the time, the two countries agreed to draw a straight line left of the small lake and over to the Mississippi River, and Great Britain and America lived happily ever after, and the border was finalized. Then the War of 1812 took place, and with the conclusion of the war largely being a tie where there was no clear winner, the issue of the U.S.-Canadian border was still left to be worked out. After much deliberation, they settled on the 49th parallel, which is still the border today, but this only extended through the recently acquired Louisiana Purchase and to the eastern edge of the Oregon Territory within the Rocky Mountains. The issue with the Oregon Territory was that both Britain and the Americans claimed the Oregon Territory as their own. Both countries wanted the trade, resources, and power that would come along with owning the Columbia River. The main argument was at the time that America wanted as much land as they could and tried to force the 49th parallel to get land on both sides of the Columbia River. But Britain wanted to draw the border along the Columbia River itself. The main reason for the British the British put their foot down was because the massive fur trade industry that was being ran in the Oregon Territory. But to maintain peace, both sides decided that joint civilian occupation would be best. So, for a while, that took place. But that didn't guarantee both sides would agree with each other in the Oregon Territory. This peace lasted a good couple of decades until the 11th president of the U.S., James Polk, was elected in 1845. Polk himself was an extremist for Manifest Destiny and for pushing our border even further west, and the co-occupation of the Oregon Territory made him upset like a little baby who wasn't getting the candy he wanted. At this point, Britain wanted the U.S.-Canada border to be the Columbia River, once it was underneath the already agreed upon 49th parallel, but Polk wanted to be the 49th parallel absolutely, where we would gain a large part of modern-day Washington and Oregon. Polk threatened war by pulling out of the occupation agreement, but in the end, both sides didn't want to go to war because Britain liked the trade between them, and America got into war Both sides didn't want to go to war because Britain liked the trade between them, and America got into war shortly thereafter with Mexico in the Mexican-American War. But in the end, Britain's hand was forced, and in 1846, a treaty was signed confirming the 49th parallel as the border between America and Canada. Okay. Here's where the Pig War finally begins. The treaty was all in good until it reached the San Juan Islands, which are northwest of Seattle and directly east of Vancouver, British Columbia, in modern-day terms. The issue with the treaty was its verbiage. The treaty says that, and I quote, "The said 49th parallel of north latitude to the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and thence southerly through its middle of the said channel, and of Fuca's Straits to the Pacific Ocean." Here, I'd like you to either look up a map of the Pig War or just an image of the San Juan Islands. I'm going to give you a second here. If you don't have the chance to look up an image of the Pig War or San Juan Islands, just imagine a random scatter plot or cluster of islands with no clear passages except for directly down the middle, to the far left, or to the far right. That would give each country total control over the islands. Okay. So where's this middle channel? There isn't one. This led to huge disputes on both sides, with both sides claiming different channels, either fully east or fully west, to claim the entirety of the San Juan Islands to either the British or the Americans. This held the islands in dispute and contention, which would have led to another great war between both the Americans and the British. But at the time, this discrepancy in a treaty for a rather small set of islands was not high on either the Americans or the Brits' to-do list, but had great impact on the local settlers in the area. The island of San Juan was eventually settled for its agricultural resources, and a massive British sheep farm was placed on the island with a handful of Berkshire pigs, which will be very important later on in the story. These sheep were owned by Charles Griffin, one of the largest landowners on San Juan Island. Right around this time, Lyman Cutler also settled on San Juan Island after a gold rush caused an influx of Americans to go on the Oregon Trail and up to modern-day Puget Sound. Anyways, Lyman Cutler was quite frankly the smartest man to ever live. He had settled down on San Juan Island and planted a potato crop. The issue was that it had a 3-sided fence. So just imagine a 3-sided fence for a second. You have a cube and you take off one side. Anyways, with this 3-sided fence, one of Charles Griffin's Berkshire pigs wandered over to the wide open potato patch and ate some of Lyman's potatoes. Here is the shot heard around the world in the story of the pig war. Lyman saw the pig eating his potatoes and shot Griffin's pig. After the fact, Lyman felt quite guilty for it and knew Griffin personally, so Lyman walked on over to Griffin's house and attempted to apologize. With already raised tensions between the conflicting beliefs of British and American occupation, Griffin demanded $100 for the pig. $1,859 to keep in mind, which is about $3,500 for a single pig. Lyman, of course, refused to pay so much money for a single pig, and afterward, Griffin grabbed some police officers and confronted Lyman and attempted to arrest him. Here is where the fundamental issue of the pig war took place. At this point, British officials were attempting to arrest an American man who believed that he was on American soil, while British officials were attempting to arrest an American man on British soil after he destroyed British property. At this point, William S. Harney, the United States General in charge of the Department of Oregon, heard of the story and ran as fast as he could to the San Juan Islands. Harney had a reputation for being unable to be ordered around and hated being told what to do. And during the Mexican-American War, he was court-martialed 4 times for disobeying orders. With the opportunity to redeem himself and achieve personal glory, he wanted to take control of the situation, get a win for the Americans, and fully redeem himself. With this, he immediately started to attempt to incite a war to claim the San Juan Islands for the United States. In order to do this, he had the George Pickett, who's now infamous for Pickett's charge from the Battle of Gettysburg in the later American Civil War, and sent him to the San Juan Islands to set up a military camp on the island. Plus, on top of having a military camp, he placed a sign down that said only American laws applied to the San Juan Islands. Research, I found a bunch of primary sources of the pig war and found this news story from the St. Cloud Democrat, a newspaper from Minnesota. Although newspapers at the time didn't call it the pig war, they called it the San Juan Island occupation, the British in San Juan, and a couple other names in that area. Anyways, an article published gives a glimpse of what the public thought of Harney. Quote, America and the UK got along peaceably together until later when, for not some well-explained reason, General Harney, in command of the American troops on that coast, ordered Captain Pickett with his company to take military possession of the island and exercise exclusive jurisdiction over it. At this point, to my knowledge, the British vacated the island and instead went to Vancouver Island with James Douglas. Douglas was originally the Hudson's Bay, or Canada, chief factor at Fort Vancouver, Washington, and was forced to relocate to Fort Victoria because of American settlers in 1858 during a gold rush, which brought Lyman Cutler to San Juan. After he was moved to Vancouver Island, he became the governor and thought that the San Juan Islands were undeniably British. In fact, back in 1853, he was the one who sent Charles Griffin, the sheep farmer and pig owner, to San Juan Island to start his sheep farm. Douglas himself hated Americans because they had already pushed him out of Washington into Vancouver Island, and he didn't want to be moved again. At this point, Douglas saw Pickett's camp of American soldiers across the bay and ordered that the British would also set up camp on San Juan Island. But if he did this, the Americans vowed that they would open fire. Douglas ordered Royal Navy officer Captain Jeffrey Hornby to send troops to San Juan Island, but Hornby refused Douglas's orders, which kept the conflict from breaking out into an all-out war. The leading British admiral in the region, Rear Admiral Baines, who outranked Douglas, heard of the situation and headed over to San Juan. Once he heard the full context of the situation, he was stunned at the utter lunacy of having such an intense conflict over the shooting of a pig. Right then, he canceled all of Douglas's orders and staved off British forces and instead pursued peace. From here, Baines enforced a small ceasefire and made it so everybody would all hang out until word of the conflict got back to London and Washington, D.C. Once word got back, both the American and British governments were shocked by what was going on, how a single pig could start such a baffling conflict. The General Winfield Scott, who at the time was the commanding general of the entire U.S. Army, a veteran of the Mexico-American War, and was known for negotiating in past border disputes with Britain, was sent to San Juan Islands. In fact, only a few years earlier, funnily enough, during the Mexico-American War, a handful of years later, funnily enough, during the American Civil War, Scott led the charge at Gettysburg and, to make a long story short, helped the Union win one of the pivotal battles in the Civil War, even repelling Pickett's charge in the process. The funny thing is that Winfield Scott had already dealt with Harney's insubordination during the Mexico-American War. Due to this and the ridiculousness of the situation, Scott took a strong disliking to Harney and his policy of attempting to incite a war to grab a handful of relatively meaningless islands in the Pacific Northwest. Scott went to San Juan Islands to mediate, according to the New York Herald, which oddly enough loved the Pig War and published over a dozen news stories, said in September 1859, quote, "In an English map now before us we perceive they are claimed as British property. This is nothing new. We have seen such things before. As far as we can fairly judge from the documents before us, our claim is a rightful one and will be insisted on. General Scott is no doubt fortified with the proper evidence and will be able to make a correct deduction of the title." End quote. Once Scott arrived, both sides gave conflicting reports of where the pig was, when it was shot, and the context around it. At this point, Scott reprimanded just about everybody except for the British, who were fairly level-headed and never overreacted to the Americans' actions. In fact, if the British hadn't acted so calmly, there wouldn't have been an all-out war. At this point, Scott reprimanded everyone except for the British, who were fairly level-headed and never overreacted to the Americans' actions. In fact, if the British hadn't acted so calmly, there would have already been an all-out war by now. Scott ended up cutting a deal with Britain where a joint military operation would take place until the U.S. and British governments could decide what to do with the islands. As part of the agreement, Pickett was not allowed back on the island, and after telling Harney this, Scott left and went back to the east where the American Civil War was beginning to show its signs of beginning. Harney was left in charge and, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the joint operation was a farce and sent Pickett back to the island. Harney was still recklessly calling for war and attempting to incite it by writing a letter to the British saying that the U.S. troops did not recognize the agreement and that San Juan was theirs. Harney was still threatening war and was finally removed from San Juan by Winfield Scott. From there, the joint operations went ahead and things were relatively peaceful. The two sides got along great and celebrated national holidays together. The British troops celebrated the 4th of July and American troops celebrated the King's birthday. The Pig War had finally militarily concluded in October 1859. At this point, the lands were still disputed, but the conflict was pushed aside due to the American Civil War breaking out in 1861. The issue was that during the American Civil War, the British began to show support for the Confederacy. Due to this, relations between Britain and the U.S. soured. After the Pig War finally militarily concluded in October 1859. At this point, the lands were still disputed, but the conflict was pushed aside due to the American Civil War breaking out in 1861. The issue was that during the American Civil War, the British began to show support for the Confederacy. Due to this, relations between British and the U.S. soured. After the Civil War concluded, there were several gripes still held between them. Eventually, the conflict over the San Juan Islands was sent to international arbitration. The Germans were trusted to end the border dispute of the San Juan Islands in 1872, well over 13 years after the conflict had militarily ended, and in the end, Emperor Wilhelm I decided that the San Juan Islands would go to the Americans. Shortly thereafter, on the 25th of November, 1873, the last British troops left the San Juan Islands. The Pig War finally concluded with 0 casualties, with only a single pig, owned by Charles Griffin, dying a martyr. And with that, thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about squabbles in the American West with me, Megan, and Chloe. And until next time, this has been the Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College.
Hey guys, and welcome to the Not So Final Frontier podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. Today's episode is titled Death, Corruption, and Shootouts. In this episode, we are going to talk about, death, corruption, and shootouts. Who would have guessed? We are going to dive into a family of murderers, one of the most famous Western gunfighters, and a lawless desperado. I'm your host today, Sydney Martin, and I'm here with Gracia. And today we are going to dive into something a little more sinister in America's history.
Tell me more.
Well, have you heard of the Bloody Benders?
The Bloody Benders.
Well, yeah, they were this family who lived in Kansas.
Well, why were they called the Bloody Benders?
Well, to put it in short, they liked killing people.
They killed people. That escalated fast. Why did they kill people? How did they do it?
Whoa. Slow your roll there, man. I'll get to that. No need to rush.
Okay, I'm sorry.
You're good. Let's start at the beginning. This story takes place in Kansas, Labette County to be exact, in the years 1871 to 1872. The Benders were a migrant family from Germany consisting of John, Pa Bender, Elvira, Ma Bender, and their children John Jr. and Kate. There is some speculation that they weren't even a real family, but nothing was ever proven.
That makes it even more weird. So did they just kill people in their house or what?
No, they actually ran an inn. Kate, the daughter, was a self-trained psychic and healer, and they would hold seances and contact spirits. That's one of the things that got people to visit them. At the time, trying to contact spirits and all was normal. Weird, right? But they did it for a reason. After the Civil War, people were trying to deal with all this death, so they turned to contacting spirits to give them some sort of closure. But Kate was only using spiritual contact to lure people in.
If I lived back then, I wouldn't have fallen for that.
Well, don't say that. You never know. You could have been grieving and looking for closure, and they seemed to be nice people from the outside, but on the inside, they killed people and all.
Shut up. I could have totally survived all that.
All right, fine. Let's take a deeper look and really see if you could have outsmarted the Benders.
Fine then.
All right. Let's start with some background information, starting with Pa Bender. He was seen as a giant, a tall, rugged man. He had a very thick accent that no one could understand. He was 60 years old during the short time that the murders took place. And then, his lovely wife, Ma, Elvira Bender, was a short, stout woman, heavy-set, also with a thick accent that no one could understand. She was 55 years old at the time, and she was not very popular amongst her neighbors. They called her She-Devil. She even threatened to cast spells and charms on her neighbors. She was just rude. We've all had that one neighbor that just lives to see the world burn. Her husband and son even feared her wrath.
I mean, who isn't scared of the woman of the house?
I believe it. My mom's scary, not gonna lie. All right, let's keep going. John Bender Jr. was described as a handsome, tall young man, aged 25. He spoke very good English with a slight German accent. He was one of the translators for his thick accented parents. Lastly, there was Kate Bender. She was described as a lovely person who was very beautiful, the most social out of the entirety of the family. She was also a self-proclaimed psychic and a spiritualist, as discussed earlier. She would give these lectures on religion and spiritualism, basically preaching. In some of the lectures, she even talked about the justification of murder.
That makes it even more sinister. She was talking about killing people probably while she was killing people, and they didn't have a clue? That's messed up.
Well, yeah, she's probably the most important Bender of them all.
Well, why is that?
When the Benders were finally discovered, most of the blame was put on Kate because of how weird she was. Well, not really weird, but witchy. You know what I'm saying?
No, I know what you're saying. I guess everyone needs a scapegoat, including a family of murderers.
Exactly.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Where did the murders happen, and why did it happen? I know it was an inn or whatever, but I need more detail.
Okay, good question. So this is going to sound completely unrelated, but I promise it's all connected.
Okay, continue.
This has to do with the Civil War.
The Civil War? Oh, come on. That's a reach.
No, I promise. It's pretty much the beginning. Because of the Civil War, there was a lot of land disputes. When Kansas decided to join the Union and the war raged on, bleeding Kansas would have been a trending term back in the day. If you listen to episode 2 of the podcast, you can learn all about it. Bleeding Kansas bred a state of hardened people. When the war was over and people were used to violence spreading around Kansas.
Okay, I believe you now. That is connected. Continue.
Okay. John Bender got 160 acres of land in Labette County, Kansas, where he built a cabin. It soon grew into a grocery store where people and travelers could stay for the night, kind of like an inn. The front half of the cabin housed the groceries and a dinner table for travelers to eat. A curtain separated the front and the back. In the back was the bed where people could sleep. But keep that curtain in mind. I'll circle back to that. And the funny thing is, it was advertised as a safe place for travelers, too. Ironic, isn't it?
They really be misleading people.
For real, though, imagine trying to have a nice rest and someone just winds up killing you. I can only imagine. Everything was going great until they tried to kill me with a hammer. But you can't really leave a Yelp review when you're dead.
Whoa, wait, is that how they killed their victims, with a hammer?
Kind of.
Kind of. What do you mean, kind of?
Okay, let me give you a quick rundown. A traveler would come to the inn, preferably someone who traveled alone. They would sit them down for dinner at the table in front of the cabin.
Well, at least they got their final meal, man.
Yeah, if they got that far. Then a bender that would hide behind the curtain, remember how I said I would circle back to that? Well, the person behind the curtain will knock out the person at the table. The body would be thrown down a trapdoor to the cellar where another bender was waiting to slash their throat and bash their skull in.
Oh my gosh, that's just terrible, and there's no reason for it.
Nope, no motive at all. They just did it.
How many people did they kill?
Well, it's very uncertain. 11 deaths were confirmed, but some bodies were too mutilated or dismembered to be entirely sure. They didn't have the technology back then to really tell who was who and what belonged to who.
Well, were they ever caught, or did they get put away for what they did?
The ending of their story is kind of a long one and a little complicated.
Please explain. I'm so invested now.
Okay, well, there were body parts that started showing up in the countryside, and the people in the town started to worry that there was something or someone out there killing people.
Something? They think it was an animal or something?
Well, when body parts show up in the countryside, I don't think people back then, or even now, think it would be a human.
Fair enough.
Another downfall to the Benders was a particular person they killed.
I guess they weren't careful enough.
Nope, they really messed with the wrong person. At first, the disappearances didn't raise any alarms because it was normal for people to come and go and to never be seen again. After all, they did cater to travelers. But the body parts and the more frequent disappearances started to raise a few bells, even in neighboring towns.
Did they get too greedy or something? Or went too far?
That is what most people say. They just couldn't stop the killing. Now, the guy who really caused people to question what was going on was a well-known physician by the name of Dr. William H. York of the town of Independence.
Oh, they went after someone who was kind of famous and well-liked. That's not a good strategy.
Along with him and 10 other confirmed disappearances, the town realized that they needed to do something. The town organized a search party to search every single home and farm throughout Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek.
Well, that's actually a really smart plan. So is this how they caught them?
Nope, they weren't caught.
What? What do you mean they weren't caught?
They just weren't. A really bad storm postponed the first search party. That is when people noticed that the Bender Inn was abandoned. No one was there, and their animals were unfed. Suspicions grew deeper, and they searched the house.
So they got away?
Hold on, I'm not there yet. So they searched the house. The smell in the cabin was so foul. That is when they found the bodies in the cellar. They then found more bodies and dismembered parts in the garden. The place where the bodies were found was called Hell's Half Acre.
That's downright creepy.
So many people flocked to the Bender's Inn trying to get souvenirs and reporters writing stories, and those who were simply just curious, of course, started talking and making up theories about what happened. The most famous one is how they did it. Kate would charm the people with her social skills, and that is when Pa or John Jr. bashed a traveler over the head with a hammer. Then Ma and Kate would get them to the cellar where Kate would slit their throats.
Now I see why Kate was placed with all the blame. She was the mastermind written all over her. But you never answered my question. Were they ever caught?
There are actually many theories around what happened to the Benders.
Is there anything that can be proven in stone about these people?
Not really. Back then, stuff like this was hard to figure out. They didn't have the technology we have today to identify people, or just forensics in general. So today, we can only rely on the speculation of people back then.
Well, that's dumb. I want to know exactly what happened.
Too bad. You might have to use your imagination for some of it. Anyway, you remember the doctor guy, right?
Yeah, the one who set up the whole research thing?
Yes, exactly. So his brother, back in Independence, was a senator, and he offered first a $1,000 reward and then a $2,000 reward to anyone who could arrest the Benders.
That's a lot of money, especially back then.
He really wanted to avenge his brother, and this is where the speculation comes in.
Jeez.
Well, there are some claims that the Benders were followed by a group of people. When they finally caught up to the Benders, they got in a gunfight, shot 3 of the family members, and burned Kate alive at the stake.
Dang, that's not a good way to go out.
Well, the thing is, that was never confirmed. Other sources say that the Benders were never caught and never seen again. No one was sure what happened to them.
Dang, those people really did some horrible things and they never even paid for their crimes.
I know, I completely agree with you. It's not fair. However, there is something that may give you some closure. A man who was caught in Idaho, funny enough, for trying to kill someone with a hammer. He was believed to be Pa Bender. However, when he was captured for his crime, he was chained by the ankle. And what he decided to do next was something straight out of a Jigsaw movie. He literally sawed his foot off.
That literally was a scene in Sawman. That's crazy. What happened next?
He bled to death.
You're kidding.
Nope, and get this, they could never identify if it was Pa Bender or not because the body rotted before they got back to it.
How does that even happen?
I have no idea. That's just what the sources say. But I don't know if I really believe that's the full story.
Yeah, I think there's a chunk of the story that we're missing. Like, we aren't getting the full story of what happened.
Oh, most definitely. Shady times.
So what was the point of this story?
There are a couple of things to take away here. Don't travel alone.
Well, that is a given, don't you think?
Also, that history is sometimes portrayed inaccurately. If you search the Bloody Benders on, let's say, Google or something, there is so much information in different versions of the events that took place. And some of them do not line up with the others. Nothing is for certain when it comes to these guys. And a lot of things on the internet are just not true at all, even about events that happened today.
So you're telling me that a family of serial killers could teach us today that not everything you read on the internet is true?
That's exactly what I'm saying. But that is kind of a reach once I think about it.
You think?
Well, anyways, that's all I got for today. Again, I'm your host, Sydney Martin, and this is Glacier Point. And this has been a part of the Death, Corruption, and Shootouts segment. And now we'll go to Caleb for our next story.
Thanks, Sydney. Now on to a story that ends with more death. When you think about the Old West, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Cowboys? Indians? Outlaws on horseback chasing down a steam-powered locomotive? Maybe you think of saloons with their rickety swinging doors, plentiful alcohol, and an old piano that sings away while a group of men wearing broad-brimmed hats sit silently, playing cards in hand. Yes, that was oddly specific, but we often boil down this era of the Old West into an oddly specific concept. That's not always true to the historical facts. This is especially true when it comes to Hollywood and the influence that pop culture has on our interpretation of history. Tombstone is an iconic film directed by George Cosmatos that has shaped views of the West. It stars actors such as Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer, Bill Paxton, and Sam Elliott. Released in 1993, the film attempts to tell the famous story of Wyatt Earp and the shootout that occurred within the city which the film was named after. While Tombstone is based on factual events, the movie is not totally historically accurate. After all, like most Hollywood productions, entertainment value often supersedes historical accuracy. Most people are probably not fully aware of the actual history surrounding Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral shootout, and today I hope to shed some light on this topic. Before we can get into any of the nitty-gritty details of what occurred on October 26, 1881, we must first explore the life of Wyatt Earp and some of the other important characters in this gripping true story. Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp was born on March 19, 1848, in the small town of Monmouth, Illinois. His parents, Nicholas Earp and Virginia Ann Cooksey, had 8 children, Wyatt being the 4th of the 8. His 4 brothers played an incredibly important role throughout Earp's life. In fact, Virgil and Morgan Earp were part of the deadly shootout that is the ultimate subject of this podcast. After spending the majority of his childhood in Illinois and nearby Iowa, in 1864, Earp with his family moved to San Bernardino in Southern California. The majority of the Earp family moved back to Illinois before the end of the decade. Wyatt and his older brother Virgil, however, moved to Wyoming during this time, seeking work and a life of their own. Wyatt did not stay in Wyoming long, though. By 1870, he was living near his family again in Lamar, Missouri. The same year, he was elected to be the constable, and he also married his first wife, Urilla Sutherland, who tragically died of typhoid fever not long before she was to give birth to their first child. After Urilla's passing, Wyatt began to encounter some trouble with the law. It's very likely that his wife's untimely death led to him becoming the hardened, gun-slinging man that we know him as. Throughout the 1870s, Wyatt Earp moved from place to place, working all sorts of different jobs as he attempted to find his place in America as a young man. His run-ins with the law only became more frequent, and some of the jobs that he chose to take were often shady. For example, working for brothels, likely as a bouncer. However, later in the decade, he began a career as a lawman, first in Wichita, Kansas, starting in 1875, and then in Dodge City, Kansas, the following year. From 1877 to 1878, Earp joined the gold rush in the Black Hills of South Dakota, before returning to Dodge City to become the assistant marshal. During these last years of the 1870s, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday became friends. John Henry Holliday was born on August 14, 1851, in Griffin, Georgia. After being raised in the well-mannered traditions of the American South, Holliday went away to Pennsylvania to study dentistry, and subsequently graduated in 1872 from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery. However, it is not Holliday's work in the dental field that he would be remembered for. Not long after beginning to work in a dentist's office in his home state of Georgia, Holliday was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the same disease that his mother had passed away from just less than a decade earlier. To combat this disease, Holliday decided to move west to a drier climate, hoping that the arid environment would slow the progression of the disease. He first ended up in Dallas, Texas, where he worked as a dentist once again, but he soon after took a liking to gambling and found himself to be quite good at it. Throughout most of the 1870s, Holliday traveled all over the western United States, gambling, and like his soon-to-be companion Earp, Holliday had some trouble with the law during this period. It's only natural to have a few run-ins with the law when you decide to travel the country gambling in towns known for being rough, wild, and full of young men who possess the same characteristics. As previously mentioned, it was during these travels that Doc Holliday ended up in Dodge City, Kansas, where he met Wyatt Earp, forever altering the way that these two men would be remembered in history. At this point, you might be wondering, all right, I've heard enough backstory. So how do Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and Doc Holliday end up in Arizona? Well, I'm glad you asked. Dodge City was no longer the frontier town that it used to be. Longing for adventure, Earp and his acquaintances headed for Arizona, where rumors of a new silver mining establishment called Tombstone sounded promising. In 1879, the Earp brothers began to arrive in Arizona. Virgil Earp first arrived in Prescott, where he briefly served as the town constable before transferring to Tombstone to join Wyatt and James. Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday would show up a few months later in 1880, but by no means were they late to the party. Doc Holliday had also spent some time in Prescott gambling, and when he finally showed up in Tombstone, he was an extremely wealthy man by late 19th century standards. According to some sources, Holliday may have arrived in Tombstone with a healthy $40,000 in his pocket, which when adjusted for inflation is just less than $1.2 million in today's currency. So now the stage has been set. All the necessary characters are in Tombstone, but who did they end up in a feud with and why? Well, not long after Wyatt and Morgan moved to Tombstone, they were hired to work alongside Virgil as the special marshal's assistants in the town. Quickly, conflict arose between the Earps and a local band of cowboys, mostly men with the last names McLaury and Clanton. These families were a part of the local livestock trade in Tombstone and the surrounding areas, but their business dealings were widely thought to be shady and suspicious to say the least. The McLaurys and Clantons were the main suspects in a case of mule theft. It is widely believed that they stole mules from the U.S. Army and rebranded them so that they could then be sold. Some sources also claim that Wyatt was convinced that the Clantons had stolen one of his personal horses. Aside from these claims, the Clantons and McLaurys were generally associated with being a part of an outlaw gang, known simply as the Cowboys. Throughout 1880 and into 1881, tensions between the Earps, including Holliday, and the Cowboys continued to grow, as almost no resolutions were made about any of the problems that the two sides had with each other. The resentment only grew with each interaction until everything came to a head on October 26, 1881. The following is a direct excerpt from Wyatt Earp's statement during the preliminary hearing of the Earp-Holliday case, which took place on November 16, 1881.
About a month or more ago, Morgan Earp and myself assisted to arrest Stillwell and Spence on the charge of robbing the Bisbee stage. The McLaurys and Clantons were always friendly with Spence and Stillwell, and they laid the whole blame of their arrest on us, though the fact is we only went as a sheriff's posse. After we got in town with Spence and Stillwell, Ike Clanton and Frank McLaury came in. Frank McLaury took Morgan Earp into the street in front of the Alhambra, where John Ringo, Ike Clanton, and the two Hick boys were also standing. Frank McLaury commenced to abuse Morgan Earp for going after Spence and Stillwell. Frank McLaury said he would never speak to Spence again for being arrested by us. He said to Morgan, "If you ever come after me, you will never take me." Morgan replied that if he ever had occasion to go after him, he would arrest him. Frank McLaury then said to Morgan Earp, "I have threatened you boys' lives, and a few days later I had taken it back, but since this arrest, it now goes." Morgan made no reply and walked off.
Additionally, Wyatt explained that various threats had been made towards him and his family after the arrest incident. No resolution was made during the month of October, and the tensions between the two sides continued to heat up as the month went on. The beginning of the end truly started to unfold the evening of October 25th, when Doc Holliday had a verbal altercation with Ike Clanton in the Alhambra Saloon, just up the block from the OK Corral. Threats were tossed back and forth until Ike Clanton explained to Wyatt that all of the talking big was over, making it clear that tomorrow he was ready for a real fight. The following day, rumors spread around town that the Clantons were going to kill the Earps and Holliday as soon as they got the chance.
Several townsfolk communicated to the Earps that the McLaurys and Clantons were up to no good and planning to murder Wyatt and Doc Holliday. The men were armed, ready to fight at a moment's notice. Naturally, Wyatt and Virgil sent out to confront the men with the intention of disarming them and putting an end to the threats. They came across Ike Clanton, who they promptly disarmed and took to the courthouse to be seen by the judge. Unfortunately, Judge Wallace could not be found, and so Ike Clanton and Wyatt Earp continued to quarrel. Wyatt is quoted again in court explaining,
I was tired of being threatened by Ike Clanton and his gang and believed from what he said to me and others, and from their movements, that they intended to assassinate me the first chance they had. And I thought that if I had to fight for my life with them, I had better make them face me in an open fight. So I said to Ike Clanton, who was then sitting about 8 feet away from me, You damn dirty cow thief, you have been threatening our lives and I know it. I think I would be justified in shooting you down any place I should meet you. But if you are anxious to make a fight, I will go anywhere on earth to make a fight with you, even over to the San Simon among your crowd. He replied, I will see you after I get through here. I only want 4 feet of ground to fight on.
Wyatt left the courtroom, only to run into Tom McLaury outside. Another brief altercation transpired, nearly to the point of a real fight. Barely avoiding what could have become fatal, the two men split up. And Wyatt then went into Hafford's corner to get a cigar, as you do when you're on the verge of being assassinated. Just after purchasing the cigar, Wyatt saw Frank and Tom McLaury and Billy Clanton go into the gunsmith shop located on 4th Street. Wyatt secretly followed them and soon after watched Ike Clanton join the other 3 men inside the store. They were all loading and preparing their weapons and loading extra cartridges into their belts. Wyatt then watched the men leave and head into Dunbar's Corral, one of the local bars in downtown. Again, Wyatt Earp is quoted in court explaining,
About 10 minutes afterwards, and while Virgil, Morgan, Doc Holliday, and myself were standing on the corner of 4th and Allen Streets, several people said there's going to be trouble with those fellows. And one man named Coleman said to Virgil Earp, They mean trouble. They have just gone from Dunbar's Corral into the OK Corral, all armed, and I think you had better go and disarm them. Virgil turned around to Doc Holliday, Morgan Earp, and myself and told us to come and assist him in disarming them. Morgan Earp said to me, They have horses. Had we better not get some horses ourselves so that if they make a running fight, we can catch them? I said, No. If they try to make a running fight, we can kill their horses and then capture them. We 4 started through 4th to Fremont Street. When we turned the corner of 4th and Fremont, we could see them standing near or about the vacant space between Fly's photograph gallery and the next building west. I first saw Frank McLaury, Tom McLaury, Bill Clanton, and Sheriff Behan standing there. We went down the left-hand side of Fremont Street. When we got within about 150 feet of them, I saw Ike Clanton and Billy Clanton and another party. We had walked a few steps further, and I saw Behan leave the party and come towards us. Every few steps he would look back as if he apprehended danger. I heard him say to Virgil Earp, For God's sake, don't go down there, you will get murdered. Virgil Earp replied, I am going to disarm them. He, Virgil, being in the lead. When I and Morgan came up to Behan and said, I have disarmed them. When he said this, I took my pistol, which I had in my hand under my coat, and put it in my overcoat pocket. Behan then passed up the street, and we walked on down. I saw that Billy Clanton and Frank and Tom McLaury had their hands by their sides. Frank McLaury and Billy Clanton's 6 shooters were in plain sight. Virgil said, Throw up your hands, I have come to disarm you. Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury laid their hands on their 6 shooters. Virgil said, Hold, I don't mean that, I have come to disarm you. Then Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury commenced to draw their pistols. At the same time, Tom McLaury throwing his hand to his right hip, throwing his coat open like this, and jumped behind his horse. I had my pistol in my overcoat pocket where I had put it when Behan told us he had disarmed the other parties. When I saw Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury draw their pistols, I drew my pistol. Billy Clanton leveled his pistol at me, but I did not aim at him. I knew that Frank McLaury had the reputation of being a good shot and a dangerous man, and I aimed at Frank McLaury. The first 2 shots were fired by Billy Clanton and myself, he shooting at me and I shooting at Frank McLaury. I don't know which was fired first. We fired almost together. The fight then became general. After about 4 shots were fired, Ike Clanton ran up and grabbed my left arm. I could see no weapon in his hand, and at the time thought he had none, and so I said to him, The fight has commenced, go to fighting or get away, at the same time pushing him off with my left hand like this. He started and ran down the side of the building and disappeared between the lodging house and the photograph gallery. My first shot struck Frank McLaury in the belly. He staggered off on the sidewalk but fired one at me. When we told them to throw up their hands, Clanton threw up his left hand and broke and ran. I never saw him afterwards until late in the afternoon after the fight. I never drew my pistol or made a motion to shoot until after Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury drew their pistols. If Tom McLaury was unarmed, I did not know it. I believe he was armed and fired 2 shots at our party before Holiday, who had the shotgun, fired and killed him. If he was unarmed, there was nothing in the circumstances or in what had been communicated to me or in his acts or threats that would have led me to even suspect his being unarmed.
Other official accounts and reports from that day share similar details, and Wyatt Earp's testimony is believed to be fairly accurate and honest. Ultimately, it is still uncertain who shot first, but soon after Virgil Earp proclaimed that they had come to disarm the men, all hell broke loose. The gunfight was over in less than a minute, and with Tom and Frank McLaury dead in the streets of Tombstone, Arizona. Billy Clanton had been seriously injured and passed away just an hour later in a nearby house. Ike Clanton escaped the scene unharmed. Likewise, Morgan and Virgil Earp and Doc Holliday all left the scene wounded but alive. Wyatt Earp remained unscathed. The Earps and Holliday were initially arrested by local Sheriff John Behan, but after a short trial that lasted less than a month, all of the defendants were justified in their actions by Judge Wells Spicer. It should be noted that Judge Spicer was loosely related to the Earps, which may have had an impact on their freedom. But hey, that's law and order in the West for you. Virgil and Morgan Earp were both murdered less than 6 months after the shootout in Tombstone, showing us that vigilante justice isn't just something that the so-called good guys get to use. Tombstone, while undoubtedly a great film, fails to show the complete backstory of Wyatt Earp and his companions. The film paints him as a heroic career lawman, a man that serves justice in the end, but in reality he could be argued to be just as shady as the so-called antagonists of the story. So what are we to take away from all this information? Law and order in the West was oftentimes complicated and blurred the lines of justice. It may be obvious, but even films and stories that are admittedly based on true events don't always paint a complete picture of what actually happened. The American West was full of adventure and many, many fantastic stories, oftentimes more alluring than the Hollywood retellings that we have become so accustomed to. I hope that I have been able to shed some light on the real Wyatt Earp, as well as the infamous shootout that he was a part of. Fact is often more interesting than fiction. Know your history, folks. Now I'll pass along the mic to Gracia for another story about death.
Hello and welcome to the third segment of this episode, Death, Corruption, and Shootouts. I'm Gracia Point and I'm here with Sydney Martin. In the last 2 segments, Sydney and Caleb have told some stories about a few of the stereotypes of the West, death and corruption. While we're on the topic of Western stereotypes, let's look at one of my favorite topics, highwaymen. Highwaymen were often depicted as rough and rowdy, with no sense of direction or purpose other than to take what they wanted at any cost. Common perceptions surrounding murderers, highwaymen, and outlaws were shootouts and standoffs. These stereotypes have an origin, and many of these stories are of real people.
Wait, there are real stories of highwaymen? They're just not a stereotype?
These were very real people. I found a story from the 1850s to the 1860s about a man by the name of Sam Brown. This guy was huge, 6 foot tall, 200 pounds, flaming red hair, and had a broad 6 foot tall, 200 pounds, flaming red hair, had a broad, full chest, and he was said to have possessed double the physical strength of ordinary men.
Wait, that name sounds familiar. Is this the guy, Bad Man Sam Brown? The guy who was notorious for his pistol that had a notch for every man he had killed?
The very man indeed. For some context, Bad Man Sam was active during the 1860s and operated in parts of California, Texas, and Carson Valley, Nevada. He was so feared that the police were terrified to do anything about him. Another nickname for Sam was the Hold-Up Guy or Fighting Sam. While researching this story, what I found most interesting was how Sam Brown was taken down.
Why did Brown begin killing in the first place? I'm sure there was a motive behind it. Did you find anything about that in your research?
That's a good question, actually. I found an article in the Pacific Historian by Sally Zanjani that looks at the history behind Brown. The common problem is that the name Samuel or S. Brown is hard to track due to how common it is. Historians think that Brown was the son of an Ohio tavern keeper, and it is hard to be sure where given the limited records. We have some information from the records from his time in jail, as well as articles from the newspapers talking about his takedown. We know that he may have started his career as a frontier desperado in Texas, where it is believed he committed his first murder around 1850. He is reported to have traveled through California. In my research, I was not able to find out why Brown committed murders, other than the victims were connected to Brown in a way that prompted a revenge response. Henry Van Sickle is one example of how an alleged connection with an enemy of Sam Brown got him in trouble. We'll come back to Van Sickle, but back to the backstory.
But if he began killing people in the 1850s, that mean he was killing people for over 10 years? If they knew who was committing the murders, why was he able to keep going for so long?
Crazy thing. Brown was arrested in 1855 for killing 2 men who refused to let him in on a gambling table. He was sentenced to 2 years hard labor in prison. What's even more interesting is that Brown was reviewed as a fine-looking man when he was sober. He did not fit the typical stereotype of a rough villain. In the article from the Pacific Historian, Brown is described by 3 49ers, C.W. Haskins, R.G. Dean, and Benjamin K. Thorne. Haskins remembers Brown as a fine-looking man, congenial while sober. Dean writes of Brown's usually good-mannered smile and the happy-go-lucky demeanor. In his friendliness, writes of Brown's usually good-natured smile and happy-go-lucky demeanor, his friendliness and his enthusiasm, and states that his personal appearance was anything but that of a desperado. Dean also denotes considerable space to an 1859 incident in Clarksville over a game of cards that suggests Brown was capable of restraint as long as he had not been drinking. Though goaded and insulted by the quarrelsome Happy Bates, Brown retaliated with nothing more damaging than a few slaps from his scabbard-covered knife. Sheriff Thorne recalls that when he rode up to arrest Brown after the killing of the Chilinos, Brown had the drop on him, but he felt confident that Brown was too brave a man, meaning too honorable, to fire without first hailing him. Events proved him right. Brown knew how to act around other people in many different circles. This demeanor actually aided in his release from prison. California has records of 2 different release petitions filed on Brown's behalf. One of the petitions was from the sheriff, and the other was from officers at San Quentin. Sam Brown was released based on petitions from the very people who put him in prison to begin with.
They thought that because he seemed to be a good guy, he didn't need to be in prison? I feel like that is only bound to end badly.
Oh yeah, it was absolutely a bad idea. By the time he arrived in Comstock in 1859, he already had the reputation of a bad killer. In February 1860, he shot a man in the leg over a drinking dispute. This man, who was Hampton Bilbo, ended up dying from the wound.
Brown was arrested after that, right?
Absolutely not. He was actually found innocent of those charges and was freed. Brown then stabbed a man, Homer Woodruff, 3 months later for a similar incident. What is even more interesting about these 2 murders is the fact that Brown's victims were unarmed. And Brown could never argue that his murders were a result of self-defense, especially when even the police did not know how to hold Brown accountable for long enough for the charges to stick. Overall, Brown claimed to have killed a total of 11 men. However, only 5 have been confirmed, with a total of 8 possible murders. In July 1861, Brown would have his last stand, on his birthday no less.
That's one unlucky birthday. This is starting to sound familiar. This is when Brown went after that innkeeper in Carson Valley. Henry Van Sickle, wasn't it?
It is exactly that. Brown had a grudge over Van Sickle because Brown believed that Van Sickle had helped Brown's enemy, who was looking for revenge over one of his murders. Brown refused to accept the explanation that the innkeeper was not involved.
If I remember correctly, the innkeeper was able to gather a group of his friends to ambush Brown from the road, and later in the innkeeper's barn, right?
That's correct. It is said that Henry Van Sickle feared that killing Brown was the only way to save his own life. After Brown had been killed, Van Sickle was examined to determine if he should be held accountable for Brown's death. In an article in a Sacramento newspaper, witnesses state that Brown had threatened by telling him to run. Witness later explained that shooting Sam Brown was the only way to stop him, and that Van Sickle made sure that Brown's body was not further disturbed once he was certain Brown was dead.
How certain are we of the accounts of Sam Brown?
That's a great question. It can be hard to solidify some of the accounts with existing documents. Things like who Sam Brown was and the number of people he killed is hard to track without records. What is fascinating is how the view of Sam Brown is different from other killers like Johnny Barnes in Arizona and George Bennett in Texas. Brown was not seen as a villain who was rough and hard to get along with. Brown was personable, good-looking, and brave when he was sober, and is said to have been a good person to be around. Sally Jan Janey briefly talked talks about how Brown was having a lover. It is uncommon for most killers like this to have someone they are committed to. Another thing that sets Brown apart is his use of a knife alongside a pistol. This made it hard in some respects to trace which murders were from Sam Brown other than those that he did in a public place.
That's so interesting. I guess it would make sense to use more than one weapon. I think the craziest part of this story is that Sam Brown was able to finesse his way throughout the Southwest, while lawmen were unable to really do anything about it.
You are absolutely right. Something that the story helps bring light into is a few of the common stereotypes that the West had. Due to the limit of information available on Sam Brown, it is hard to truly know all that went down in the end. What is important to see is that stereotypes often come from a source or precedent of some kind. Sam Brown was a murderer and a highwayman, yet he does not fully fit the picture that someone may think when hearing those labels. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about some of the stories surrounding death, corruption, and shootouts in the West. Until next time, this has been the Not So Final Frontier podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College.
Welcome to the Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. I'm your host, Peyton. On today's episode of Man vs. Nature, we're going to introduce you to 3 different stories. Firstly, how natives overcame the challenges and used nature to their advantage. Secondly, our resident San Francisco expert Dan will take you through the 1906 earthquake. And lastly, Isaac, who will examine the importance of barbed wire and the diesel engine in the West. In this segment of Man vs. Nature, I'm joined here by Megan. Today, Megan, we're going to be looking at an often forgotten group of the American West and arguably one of the most successful groups at using nature to their advantage. Can you guess who I'm referring to?
I believe who you're referring to is the Native Americans.
Yes, so John Gregory Burke was a lieutenant with the 3rd U.S. Cavalry from 1871 to 1883, and while he himself was not a Native American, he had many interactions with tribes and gained a lot of sympathy for them. Burke kept a very detailed journal of his interactions with the Southwest Apaches, Nez Perce, Sioux, Cheyenne, and the Moqui tribes. However, he spent most of his time with tribes in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, detailing the food they ate, their fishing and hunting practices, and ritualistic aspects of how these tribes operated and used the land to their advantage. Because of him, we have quite a few detailed accounts of these Western tribes.
So, what can you tell me about how these tribes used nature to their advantage?
The first thing I thought that was really interesting was the distillation process of an alcoholic drink called pulque, which was produced by New Mexican tribes. These tribes had been utilizing this process for centuries. Pulque is obtained from the American aloe plant, also known as agave, in 2 different ways. The first method ferments the sap to create a beer-like drink that is consumed in large quantities by these tribes. It could even be mixed with strawberries, pineapple, orange, lime, and sometimes even pomegranate. In the second method, the sap is mixed with lime water and various noxious roots to make it more potent. This drink actually became very popular in parts of Texas and was sold in cantinas or bars in large quantities, not only to native populations but also to American Texans.
So you said this drink was consumed in large quantities. How intoxicating was it?
The stigmatization of pulque goes back to early Spanish contact. Christopher Columbus and Cortez reported that Indians would drink it and become drunk. Spanish sources looked at the drink negatively, saying that tribes mixed it with various roots and berries, which would make it poisonous and lead them to commit adulteries, make sacrifices to pagan gods, and commit other vices. Though the drink became popular in Texas, there were still stigmas surrounding it, especially in the 1890s with the rise of growing support for prohibition. However, the drink was extremely low in alcohol content. It's only around 2% to 4% alcohol at the most. For comparison, kombucha, which is really popular now, is about 0.5 to 1%. So getting drunk off of pulque is actually really difficult.
What else does Burke document about these tribes?
Burke actually does a really fascinating job at documenting how these native tribes of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona adapted to different foods brought to America by Europeans. While the native peoples have always used the natural resources around them, they were surprisingly fast in adopting a number of fruits, vegetables, and domestic animals into their lifestyles. One native plant in particular holds a large importance and was even mixed with European foods later. This was the nopal, or what Burke also refers to as tuna, and is now referred to as the prickly pear cactus. This is a popular delicacy of the Apaches. Women collected the fruits, carrying them in baskets on their back. They would then brush off the thorns using a bundle of stiff hay. The nopals could be dried in the sun, eaten raw, baked, or boiled. It also became part of a popular dish called queso de tuna, a boiled, prickly pear mixture that Burke described as being most agreeable in taste. Queso de tuna, funny enough, doesn't actually contain cheese and resembles those little fruit leathers that you might buy in stores today.
Doesn't the prickly pear cactus have some medical uses as well?
Absolutely. This plant is promoted to treat anything from diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, and even hangovers. In the late 1800s, though, they were more focused on its anti-scorbutic properties, which means that it can prevent or cure scurvy. The nopal was also used to help treat fevers. Many of these tribes also made their own versions of European foods, which Burke claimed to be better in taste. For example, charamushka resembles European cake or gingerbread depending on the tribe. Marcados was a variety of tea buns, and punches were identical to European donuts.
How did these natives use plants outside of food or for basic survival purposes?
Poisonous mushrooms and toadstool were used as part of ritualistic intoxication. The fungi would be brewed into an intoxicating drink. This method of consumption became known not only among the natives but also among white settlers. It actually became so well known that it was added to the Johnson's New Universal Encyclopedia in 1878 and the American Encyclopedia in 1881. The Hualapai Indians of Arizona often used intoxicants such as mushrooms, mistletoe, rue, ivy, mandrake, hemp, and opium. Mistletoe was considered to be all healing in many different cultures. Our typical idea of mistletoe, though, was brought over by the Europeans in 1900. However, there is a native mistletoe to Texas and parts of Mexico, and it was quickly adopted by the natives for its healing properties and was often used for epilepsy, as well as to aid in childbirth, tumors, ulcers, and was believed to even cure sterility. However, funny enough, its most common purpose in native culture was as feed for sheep. Wine also became a popular drink for tribes all over America. However, the tribes adopted a tradition that Burke observed of putting a hare's retinate in wine. This was a superstition believed to help get a woman pregnant. Retinate is a stomach enzyme that is produced in some mammals, mainly goats, and was also used to bind certain cheeses together and create curds.
The natives have always been experts at living off the land, but it's really interesting to see how quickly they were able to integrate some of these invasive species into their way of life and customs.
Absolutely. And with that, I turn our next segment over to Dan. Thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of Man vs. Nature.
Humans overcome challenges. We build skyscrapers and have gone to the moon. We endure hardships common in the world, those that are self-imposed and natural. The story of the native people in the Americas is a great example of this ability to overcome and endure. There are many examples of Americans overcoming hardship, but one that is particularly powerful is the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. We start with the account of one resident.
The San Francisco earthquake is an excellent example of people stubbornly refusing to bend to nature's will by not moving somewhere that doesn't routinely experience natural disasters. Instead, we all collectively sit down and brainstorm inventions that mitigate the damage caused by these disasters. Having solved that conundrum, humanity turned its indomitable spirit towards a more noble venture, breaking up the land and solidifying a class system based on the amount of property you own. This was done with an ingenious and meticulous invention that completely changed the way ranching happened. This invention was, of course, barbed wire. Yes, that's right, barbed wire. Barbed wire spelled the end of the iconic and endless age of the American West. All right, buddy, we've heard enough about what this wire did and why it was effective. We want to hear how it was invented, I hear you saying. Well, not to worry. Not only do I have the story behind its invention, it's short and sweet. Joseph Glidden was attending a fair in Illinois when he saw a wooden fence with wire protrusions designed to keep cows from knocking the fence over. His wife encouraged him to pursue his spin on the idea and had him test it by fencing in her garden. It's worth noting that Glidden wasn't the first guy to invent barbed wire, but his version was the first that was actually economically viable. Glidden won several court battles over the rights to his wire, and in a display of heretofore unrivaled smugness and poor sportsmanship, named his version the winner. You might be asking yourself, how could a piece of wire invented on October 27, 1873, kill the cowboy? Well, barbed wire brought an end to the open-range cowboy lifestyle, as it allowed farmers to build a most meticulous and composite structure, a fence. Before barbed wire was patented and sold, fences that could hold and store cattle were made from wood, which had to have been shipped across long distances. Not many trees grew in the Great Plains. It took an obscene amount of wood to build a fence large enough to hold cattle on a pasture. As you can imagine, most ranchers couldn't afford the expense. This little roadblock saw the innovation of the cowboy, a man whose job was to roam with the cattle and keep them on the cattle owner's land. His job was incredibly important, as land and cattle disputes were something that could easily end in violence even today. Though ranchers were used to running cattle over wide open spaces, the advent of barbed wire created a physical outline to cement property lines. It also kept small-time ranchers from easily driving their cattle to the slaughterhouse or railhead. Before land was fenced off, people could freely move cattle across anyone's land, and they often had to as they moved their cattle to market. Now they couldn't, and that led to the conflict we call the fence-cutting wars. These conflicts largely consisted of people trying to push private land back into the public domain by cutting fences. The fence-cutting wars were widespread across the West and not something confined to one area. Native Americans on the Great Plain were also greatly affected by the introduction of barbed wire. They traditionally lived nomadic lifestyles, meaning they moved around as they needed, but as the land was broken up and fenced in, it greatly limited where these people could move. Barbed wire brought an end to the immortal cowboy and the era of cattle drives, but that's only a single part of the Western gestalt. The next invention changed not only farming, but also changed transportation and commerce across the entire world. This device is, of course, the humble diesel engine. In 1893, in a bid to address some of the inefficiencies of gasoline engines, a German inventor named Rudolf Diesel set out to design a new engine after graduating at the top of his class from the Royal Bavarian Polytechnic of Munich, known today as just the Technical University of Munich. Diesel experimented with steam engines by conducting research into fuel and thermal efficiency. In one infamous experiment, Diesel added ammonia vapor to a steam engine, which made it explode and nearly killed him. After an ungodly number of failed experiments, Diesel was granted a patent for a new engine. Rudolf Diesel's engine was much more efficient than a traditional gasoline engine. Not only are diesel engines more efficient, they're also able to run on heavier and less refined fuel than gasoline engines. This heavier fuel is known as diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is cheaper to refine and less likely to explode when coming in contact with a source of ignition, making it ideal for military vehicles. By 1908, the first commercial truck was given a diesel engine. As a result of extremely high cylindrical pressures within a diesel engine, the first models were too large and heavy for smaller vehicles. Despite the improvements made to gasoline engines, the diesel engine has maintained its place as a viable option for the world's commercial vehicle market. But what about the world's farming vehicle market of the early 20th century, you might be asking? Well, as you can imagine, the invention and subsequent introduction of the diesel engine revolutionized farming. Test number 208, the Cat 60 was the first diesel tractor tested under the Nebraska Tractor Test Law. One of the greatest advantages of the tractor was that you only had to feed it diesel rather than the grain and water required by working farm animals. In fact, 6 acres of land had to be set aside per animal per year just to keep them fed. The change to using mechanical power as opposed to animal power made farming easier and more efficient. It also increased productivity, 2 major selling points for the tractor. But what really sold farmers on this new farming technology was the price. Because of the tight competition, companies resorted to selling tractors for less than they cost to produce, making tractors a financially viable option for small-time farmers. In 1916, around 20,000 tractors had been sold. By 1935, the number jumped to over 1 million. The diesel engine revolutionized the entire world. Everything from transportation to farming was affected by this humble invention. However, for all its benefits, the diesel engine created problems we're still dealing with today. Land covered by paved roads and air so thick with smog that a Chinese artist walked around Beijing with a vacuum for 100 days and managed to make a brick with the junk he sucked out of the air. The diesel engine and barbed wire essentially remade farming and ranching. Barbed wire broke the land into chunks, parceling and privatizing it, while the diesel engine allowed farming to be done at a scale never before seen and certainly not achievable by a single person. These 2 inventions spelled the end of the American West and created the world we know today. That concludes our segment on man versus nature. Be sure to check out our other segments for more history on the American West. Thanks for listening to The Not So Final Frontier.
And now for something different. A story of defiance. There are many great Native American leaders in the history of our nation, like Geronimo, Crazy Horse, and Chief Joseph, who each led their tribes to great things. Sitting Bull, like most other Native American leaders, resisted the U.S. government's attempts to secure native land. The American government pushed too far and asked too much of Native tribes in the 19th century. The government's treatment of Sitting Bull and his tribe was unacceptable. Sitting Bull led his tribe to safety, posed as a major spiritual leader, and rebelled against the U.S. as much as possible. He understood that if he let the U.S. government control him and drive him around, that he would have no independence, freedom, or choice. Sitting Bull's actions are a reflection of his resistance to European American rule, a rule that decides who gets the best land, who gets food and shelter, and who lives and dies. Sitting Bull did not want this kind of pseudo-enslavement for his people, where they would live under the U.S. government's laws instead of their own. Sitting Bull was born in 1831 to Jumping Bull and her holy door, and was given the Lakota name Hokasise, which translates to Jumping Badger. He was later nicknamed Hakesni, meaning slow, careful, and unhurried. He was born near Grand River, Dakota Territory, into the Hunkpapa division of the Teton Sioux. The Sioux are a group of natives located around the Dakotas and Nebraska. Sitting Bull was a part of the Teton Sioux, also known as Lakota. When Jumping Badger was 14, he was on his first war party with his father. They took horses from the Crow tribe. When they returned, his father gave him an eagle feather, a sturdy horse, and a buffalo hide shield to mark his son's passage into manhood. His father also bestowed upon him his name, Tatanka Iatake, meaning buffalo who sits down. The Dakota War of 1862 started when several bands of eastern Dakota natives killed around 500 to 800 European American settlers and soldiers in southern Minnesota in response to the poor treatment by the U.S. government. The natives would have to try and deal with corrupt government agents that would limit their supply of food for monetary gain. The treaties between the natives and the U.S. were being trampled. The conflict drew the attention of the U.S. Army Brigadier General Alfred Sully as he led an attack on a village believed to be responsible for the killings. When tribal leaders like Sitting Bull, Gall, and Inkpaducah defended them, General Sully attacked the largest group instead of the offending group. The conflict ended with a victory for the U.S. Army, and the Lakotan and Dakotan tribes were forced to relocate. Between 1866 and 1868, a man named Red Cloud, the leader of the Oglala Lakota, involved his tribe by attacking U.S. forces. Red Cloud persistently led attacks on U.S.-held forts in an attempt to secure the Powder River County in Montana, an area between Bighorn Mountain and the Black Hills. Sitting Bull assisted Red Cloud's efforts by attacking Fort Berthold, Fort Stevenson, and Fort Beaufort, as well as many others in Montana. Sitting Bull could relate to Red Cloud as the U.S. government would trample their treaties with the natives again by using Red Cloud's land. The U.S. desired a peaceful resolution to Red Cloud's conflict. Under the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, the government agreed to Red Cloud's demands and abandoned Fort Filkini with Fort C.F. Smith. An important Hunkpapa military leader, along with various other Hunkpapa and Blackfeet, signed the treaty. Sitting Bull, however, did not sign the treaty. He instead told the Jesuit missionary overseeing things, "I wish all to know that I do not propose to sell any part of my land." Sitting Bull continued to fight into the early 1870s. Between 1866 and 1869, Sitting Bull was made the supreme chief of the Sioux Nation. Sitting Bull continuously attacked migrating parties and forts, even after becoming the supreme chief. Sitting Bull's halted progress of the Northern Pacific Railway by attacked the surveyors who were trying to find a route through Hunkpapa and Lakotan lands. The survey team returned with a group of federal troops to protect them, and Sitting Bull drove them away. The survey team returned a third time with even more federal troops, and they were still driven away. The constant delays, along with the Panic of 1873, led to the bankruptcy of many Northern Pacific Railway backers. Sitting Bull naturally despised the idea of destroying his land for profit and progress. Gold was a major issue in both Sitting Bull and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's lives. Lieutenant Colonel Custer, most famously known for fighting at the Battle of Little Bighorn, led a military expedition from Fort Abraham Lincoln to explore the Black Hills for gold and to find a suitable place to construct a fort. Once Lieutenant Colonel Custer announced there was gold in the Black Hills, tensions between the Lakotan and American settlers and miners rose drastically. Sitting Bull did not attack Custer while he was on his early expeditions, but soon the U.S. government began pressuring its citizens into mining and settling the Black Hills, without providing the CU any compensation for using their land. The CU sent a delegation in an attempt to plead with Grant to uphold the Treaty of Laramie. In 1875, President Grant ordered all CU not on a reservation to be moved to one. Those that did not want to move were labeled by the Interior Department as hostiles, which allowed the military to pursue them as such. Sitting Bull adamantly refused to move his village 240 miles through the brutal winter snow. He stood his ground and gathered the assistance from the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux. Over the course of the year, his camp grew and grew up to an estimated 10,000 people. Sitting Bull then performed a sun dance where he predicted he had seen U.S. soldiers falling like grasshoppers. In 1876, the U.S. Army began tracking down any hostile natives that did not yet live on a reservation, sparking the Great Sioux War. Many Native Americans gathered at Sitting Bull's Unity Camp. He would send scouts to recruit warriors from the reservations. On June 17, 1876, Sitting Bull faced off against General George Crook in the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook claimed victory, but had a large number of losses, foreshadowing even greater losses in the future. A few days later, on June 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Custer found the largest camp. Sitting Bull took a more spiritual approach to leading, including prayers, dances, and foretelling prophecies. Crazy Horse physically led natives to surround Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his men at the Battle of Little Bighorn and killed all 262 soldiers, including Lieutenant Colonel Custer himself. While the Indians celebrated the defeat of Lieutenant Colonel Custer with feasts and dance, the U.S. was preparing thousands more soldiers to arrest the CU responsible. Sitting Bull refused to surrender to U.S. troops and crossed the border into the Northwest Territories in Canada. He remained in Canada for 4 years, refusing pardons or any chance to return. While in Canada, he united the Crowfeet and Blackfeet, longtime enemies of the Lakota, many of his tribes suffering from a lack of resources, especially game to hunt, due to American hunters lighting fires, keeping buffalo from migrating any further north. The Canadian government, to avoid conflict, refused to share food with Sitting Bull's tribe. Hunger finally pushed Sitting Bull and his tribe to surrender and return to the U.S. in 1881. Sitting Bull served 2 years as a prisoner of war in South Dakota's Fort Randall in exchange for supplies and amnesty for his people. Once Sitting Bull was released, he was moved to Standing Rock Reservation between North and South Dakota. In 1884, Sitting Bull was allowed to tour parts of Canada and the U.S. thanks to show promoter Alvarin Allen. Allen pleaded with agents James McLaughlin to allow Sitting Bull to tour. On the tour, Sitting Bull met Annie Oakley. He was so impressed by her skill with firearms that he paid to have a picture taken with her, and he symbolically adopted her, giving her the name Little Sure Shot, a name she would use her whole career. In 1885, Sitting Bull's fame grew as he joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He earned $50 a week, which is around $1,500 today, for riding around the arena. Once, Sitting Bull stayed with the show for only 4 months. However, in that time, audiences considered him a celebrity. He earned a small fortune by charging for an autograph and a picture. He often gave his money away to beggars and the homeless. Sitting Bull returned to Standing Rock Agency when his time with the Wild West show was over. Sitting Bull would become a big believer of the ghost dance movement, a religious ideal that there would be a native messiah who would usher in a new age when the buffalo returned and the country would be rid of the whites. The dance included shirts the natives believed to be bulletproof. In 1890, James McLaughlin, the U.S. agent at Standing Rock Agency, believed Sitting Bull was planning to flee the reservation with the ghost dancers. McLaughlin made a plan to arrest the chief with the assistance from the Indian police. On December 15, 1890, police surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin, knocked, then entered his cabin and informed him of his arrest. Sitting Bull refused to move. His resistance caused a great deal of noise and woke the camp. Soon the police were surrounded. When Sitting Bull continued to resist, they used force and a fight broke out. One of the Indian police shot Sitting Bull in the chest and another shot him in the head. Sitting Bull believed his life largely in defiance of the U.S. government. Each time they told him to move, he stubbornly planted his feet and proudly told them no. He fought back against Custer when the U.S. Army tried to remove them from their lands. He fought against the U.S. when they attempted to ruin his land with a railroad, and he refused to move his people through the winter cold to the reservation. Despite the U.S. insistence, he gave in when his people were the ones suffering, and suffered in exchange for their well-being. When he was being arrested, his people came to protect him. Sitting Bull is the perfect example for all leaders to follow. Your people will fight and die for you if you are willing to do the same for them.
Thanks, Dalen, for that great piece about Sitting Bull and how the infamous Wounded Knee came to be. My name is Zach Murphy. For my part in this episode, I'll be shifting gears into the history of a cultural phenomenon that is seldom acknowledged and showcases how the American West history still influences today. Geronimo, trademarked. Geronimo was a name I often yelled doing cannonballs at the public pools. I didn't know why or what it meant, or that it was even a name. All I knew is that it was something one yelled, usually doing a cannonball. That is, until I read about the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, the months-long event that featured several marvels, including none other than the Terror of the West himself, Geronimo. This exposition celebrated the centennial of Lewis and Clark's expedition out west and would display many attractions for anyone willing to pay a ticket. This included, but was not limited to, Native American chiefs to represent the conquered tribes of the frontier. Unlike the other chiefs who visited the exposition, including the Nez Perce's Chief Joseph, Geronimo was most noticeably not a chief. He also showed up in chains. This person, who many participants knew just from newspapers and possibly old cigarette trading cards, appeared old and defeated. At this time, Geronimo was in his 70s, wearing simple clothes, nothing like the native garbs expected, and sported deep wrinkles of a hardened life in the Arizona desert. Viewers expected a spectacle, and like seeing a tiger in a zoo, they were initially struck by disappointment or sympathy. But just like at the zoo, it passed, and a new opportunity to score some souvenirs and pictures with the terrifying human tiger hit the market. Geronimo appeared under military supervision due to his status as prisoner of war. Geronimo was an Apache responsible for several raids throughout the West, on both sides of the national border. There were robberies, murders, scalpings, along with any other random act of violence the courts could blame him for. After organizing 3 reservation breakouts and the resulting warpaths during the 1870s and 80s, Geronimo and his band surrendered for the last time in 1888, marking the last of the Indian Wars for the United States and starting Geronimo and the Apaches' long journey of relocation. While his lack of distinguishing Native American clothing was a disappointment for fairgoers, his ability to provide souvenirs was phenomenal. At the fair in his display, Geronimo made simple bows that were assumed high quality. He would sell the buttons off his clothes, which he had plenty of replacements. People even bought his hats, which, like the buttons, were always replaced. This was offered at a reasonable price. And if one felt frugal, entitled, or foolhardy enough to attempt to take a photograph of Geronimo without paying, his friends from the reservation would make sure he would be compensated, even going as far as breaking one fool's camera. This kicked off an eventful end to Geronimo's life, going to events across the United States and making a killing selling souvenirs. This amazing story, though, left me asking one more question. Why did I yell his name doing a cannonball? Well, I saw other kids doing that, so they probably saw other kids doing that, and so on. Memes are nothing new per se, and kids are impressionable. But where did this meme come from? Answer, early American Airborne. Cool, but why? Geronimo died in 1909 and became a POW in the 1880s. So in what relation does he have with being yelled jumping out of planes? I knew some Native American culture was appropriated by the airborne, like the Mohawk haircut and war paint, so I started looking into this to see if there's a connection. Well, I got to learn about Sergeant McNeese. Well, I got to learn that Sergeant McNeese was the bringer of Mohawks and war paint to the 101st Airborne, and that he and his family lived in Oklahoma, and his mom was Choctaw, the Geronimo thing predates his service, and even the 101st. Allegedly, these early airborne soldiers saw the film Geronimo during their training, and one soldier decided he was going to yell Geronimo when he jumped out of the plane. The sourcing for this is spotty as one could expect from trying to research an urban colloquialism. And while there is some source corroboration, their primary sourcing is usually spotty or vacant. For decades, Americans fought the Apache, and Geronimo somehow always survived. Countless conflicts occurred in the Arizona desert and mountains, and many generals and officers sought their glory for his death or capture. For decades, Americans fought the Apache, and Geronimo somehow always survived. Countless conflicts occurred in the Arizona desert and mountains, and many generals and officers sought their glory for his death or capture. Coming fresh out of academy, future General Pershing chose to lead a cavalry unit and transferred west for an opportunity at this glory, only coming short by a few weeks of his capture. This ongoing legacy of evasion, capture, and escape was the groundwork for Geronimo's legend, and result in him and his Chiricahua being the antagonists in most westerns, including the film Geronimo. After these events, though, start the sad, cruel reality of the Apache's forced relocation following Geronimo's surrender at Skeleton Canyon. Most of the children were taken to Indian schools across the United States, and the rest of the Apache were relocated to Florida. While in Florida, many Apache died from respiratory illnesses, with numbers up to 25%. After finally achieving acknowledgement that they were not suited or supported enough to live there, they were then moved to Alabama, in part of fears about the ghost dance Staten already mentioned. Another 5 years of similar issues, the Apache were then sent to Oklahoma at the Fort Sill Military Reservation, where they would be homed for the rest of Geronimo's life. In 1904, an academic who was serving as superintendent of the schools in the neighboring town of Lawton built a relationship with him during his time there and asked him to help write an autobiography. After refusal from the fort's commanding officer, saying he would sooner see Geronimo hanged than be a marvel to the public, the scholar wrote to President Teddy Roosevelt asking for permission, and with few caveats it was granted. The aspiring academic, Colonel S.M. Barrett, found his breakout piece with interpreting and transcribing the translation of Geronimo's autobiography. This would be his first of many books about Native American tribes throughout the U.S. Barrett, however, did not speak Apache, and Geronimo did not speak English. In their first interaction, Barrett helped Geronimo communicate, translating Spanish for a trade, but Geronimo's Spanish, while impressive, was not acknowledged as fluent. To help Geronimo tell his story in his native tongue, Asa Deklugi, who was one of the Apache children taken to the boarding schools after Geronimo's final surrender, interpreted the indigenous language into English, and then Barrett wrote it down, along with making edits needed for readability. This was a common situation when transcribing Native American stories into other languages. In Huzar Hernandez's article, The Real Geronimo Got Away, she dove into this autobiography and described pieces she describes as bi-autobiographies. This means to inform the reader that this is not an autobiography, but a biography written by the interpretations of an autobiography. Geronimo, by this point, is an old man who only wishes to see his people go back to their homelands in Arizona. Asa is Geronimo's nephew and a pessimistic victim of the Indian school system. While Geronimo was commonly a war chief, Asa would become the chief of his tribe. So there is little reason to suspect that either of them had much intention to alter the story due to the intent of his autobiography being a well-constructed argument trying to appeal to President Roosevelt and the American masses for the Apache to return home. S.M. Barrett is the real one to be aware of. What better way to solidify your credentials than writing the autobiography of the most notorious Indian any member of the United States or Mexico knew? This said, Barrett was not a super scummy academic comparatively at this point in his career. Geronimo had a long history of warming up to whites in their original reservation, lulling them into a false state of security before launching his breakouts, showing skill of playing off the non-Indian perceptions of him. While Geronimo was never cold to Barrett, when he learned that Barrett was wounded by a Mexican, Geronimo warmed up to him and was never shy of voicing his intolerance. This was the start of their relationship beyond a guard-prisoner dynamic, and what eventually led to Geronimo trusting Barrett enough to have him help transcribe his autobiography. Barrett did work with anthropologists on the reservation, which developed his interest in Native Americans, and while he does have a very personal stake in getting this book published, he served the source well in trying to get Geronimo's message across. This is because it is obvious Geronimo has a goal greater than simply telling his story once one makes it to the last few paragraphs of his book. Barrett wrote that and submitted it to the president and other government authorities. He supports Geronimo's body by citing news articles to corroborate, while also showing their lack of transparency or blatant bias against the Apache and Geronimo. Barrett also went as far as putting in footnotes that state Geronimo may be exaggerating in some cases, but blatantly acknowledges the injustices whites did against all Native Americans and throws his academic support behind helping Geronimo and the Apache seem justifiably sympathetic. Being a friend of Geronimo and the Apache would serve Barrett well in his future Indian studies. If one takes these factors into play, then Geronimo's autobiography is an interesting look into the Apache, Geronimo's life, and how he set his story up for his goal. I can't lie in saying I wasn't excited to see the myth from his own perspective. But beyond these factors, this is unfortunately never going to happen. Geronimo was an Apache. He led his band on countless raids and massacres and evaded the law on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border for decades. If not viewed favorably by the United States, this autobiography would not be published. If Geronimo had a burning hatred for white Americans, he would not be allowed to express it. One could then see his hatred towards Mexicans as his in to get white Americans on his side. Like most autobiographies written by Native Americans, Geronimo's story starts with the Apache creation story. If one looks past the cultural division, it's a tale close to David and Goliath, except it was Apache and a dragon, and instead of a sling and stones, it was a bow and 4 arrows. Geronimo then follows this chapter with describing the tribal layout in the region, their relationships to each other and his varying relationships with them, including his translator Asa's familial attachment to the area. He even mentioned the civility and acquaintanceship the Apache had with the neighboring Navajo. Then, Geronimo described his personal family relations with extended family leading to his parents. He tells us his childhood activities, how he became a man and all duties leading up there, showing their prowess in many civilized activities like farming and smoking tobacco recreationally. He talked about how he married his childhood sweetheart, going as far as immortalizing his father-in-law in his book as being unwilling to let her go, or not caring of their love, with just how many horses he wanted for her dowry, despite them being lifelong lovers. He left without saying a word and returned 3 days later with them, completing their marriage process. Geronimo's story turns into a tale of tragedy. In 1858, during a time of relative peace, Geronimo and his group were trading in Mexico. While there, a local garrison found their family's camp lightly guarded and launched a massacre. While returning, Geronimo and the other men encountered stragglers from the camp, fleeing towards them, saying they had been attacked. Among the dead were Geronimo's entire family, including his elderly mother, wife, and their 3 young children. The chief had them flee back to the tribe to amass a retaliatory effort. Geronimo, having lost the most, was allowed to lead. After burning all his family's possessions, Geronimo was tasked to neighboring tribes to ask for warriors to volunteer, and after hearing his story of loss, he amassed an army. Geronimo led this three-tribe coalition against the garrison in summer of 1859. Only a few braves survived, but they killed the soldiers and possibly razed an entire town. This battle is also where Geronimo gets to be called Geronimo. No one is sure why. While fighting, he used all his arrows and broke his spears and was left with only his knife. He cut down several soldiers this way, evading gunfire from all directions. Due to religious figures or inability to pronounce his real name, Goyakla, Geronimo was all that was heard from the soldiers before being stabbed to death. When it was over and they returned home, the tribe was satisfied and celebrated the spoils of victory. But for Geronimo, all he acquired was his name. This burning sense for revenge is Geronimo's reason for his warpaths into Mexico. It would be a reoccurring event, with varying sizes of bands, and often Geronimo would be the remaining survivor, returning often with less than he left with, which would only bring plenty of resentment. He did not care. He only had a constant burn for revenge for his family. This would go on for years, earning him his initial reputation of being impossible to capture, and would even cite his greatest battle fighting the Mexican army, transitioning into his part on the whites. Geronimo described the first time meeting white people, who were surveyors, and that they were a nice group of people whom they traded with, which was where he saw paper money for the first time. When the Apache met soldiers, though, is when the animosity towards whites begins. The soldiers allegedly honored no treaties, and even lied about a peace deal, which led to his chief, Magnus Colorado, being murdered, along with most of his tribe who left with him in a chapter he called the Greatest of Wrongs. Geronimo escaped this massacre because him and a small group stayed behind, for Geronimo did not trust the soldiers. This is a section Barrett helped support by going through military documents and newspapers from neighboring towns to corroborate this great betrayal. This would begin several engagements with the U.S. Army and start Geronimo's infamous series of reservation breakouts, leading up to his surrender in the 1880s. Then he details the incredibly sad aftermath of relocations, forced hard labor, no food, and no upholding of their terms for surrender, which in the chapter beforehand, Barrett shows military telegrams of the surrender, alluding little to terms of surrender, with some even going as far as saying it was unconditional. For years, Geronimo tried reaching General Miles over their terms and received no word. Barrett expressed his own opinion and skepticism in the text over the government honoring the treaty at Skeleton Canyon. While this is often marked as the last of the Indian Wars, it is not the end of Geronimo's book. He continues with a fourth part, The Old and the New, and begins the hard sell to white Americans. This begins with the unwritten laws of the Apache, the organization of legal courts, adoptions, social gatherings, in a sense to show everything Americans enjoyed or considered civilized was a part of Apache culture. Then Geronimo leads into the St. Louis World's Fair and how he returned with more money than he had ever owned. He describes all the marvels and kindness whites showed him at the event, even though it was limited because his handlers often refused many offers for him. Geronimo also showed admiration to the USA from participating in the fairs and seeing the technological marvels they built, wishing all his people could have participated. Geronimo then transitions into religion, how he adopted Christianity like a good Indian, and how it would be so generous of whites to allow the Apache to return to Arizona so they can keep learning from generous whites, and how all would be forgiven if the Apache could just return to Arizona. This story Geronimo, Asa, and Barrett tell is structured as an amazing argument. From the book's dedication to President Roosevelt by Geronimo to the several instances Barrett uses sources to help support Geronimo's argument, from telling the creation story to neighboring cohesion to show civility, he mentions working the farmlands, growing up, informing the reader the perceived nomadic Apache were part-time farmers, something Americans were very intimate with. He connects with young love. He tells his tragedy with Mexico to help establish that the Apache, and especially Geronimo himself, hated Mexicans, a feeling many white Americans shared that they hoped would be sympathized with. Geronimo's take on interactions with white Americans is often not portrayed as too racist like towards Mexicans, but in anger towards the U.S. military and their lack of trustworthiness in upholding their word, a grievance many tribes have historically shared, and Barrett himself even defends within the footnotes on more than one occasion. Unfortunately, Geronimo's plea did not fully work. Geronimo will die in Oklahoma, and soon after, in 1913, the Apache will be relocated again, this time to their current reservation area on the border of New Mexico and Arizona. While certainly closer to their ancestral home, not all the Apache are there, because of intertribal mixing from relocations, the Geronimo's Chiricahua are scattered or assimilated. The reservation setup were not new for the Apache as a whole, but the Chiricahua and others who followed Geronimo. Some other Apache went more quietly into the night, allowing them earlier reservations and land holdings, even being used as the scouts that tracked Geronimo down, connecting into Geronimo's tale of Apache losing their way when they are gone from their homeland for too long. He does not explicitly say this, but alludes to it, showing his skill historian Frederick Jackson Turner even noticed in the 1890s of how Geronimo often had a way of saying things that could be interpreted in a variety of ways. Goyakla died in 1909. Geronimo, as an indigenous POW, lives on. While his image has been shifted to a brave warrior standing against oppression, he is still being used for monetary gains, and not in a holistic wielding from the Apache neither. The Apache, while still not able to occupy their ancestral home, are used as the name for attack helicopters, firing Tomahawk trademarked missiles, even though the Apache were archers, to help spread democracy across the globe. This enduring influence built on so much vagueness and hearsay are ultimately why I think Geronimo is not only important, but a relevant ongoing legacy of the American West. So next time you're at your local pool or swimming hole and hear someone yell Geronimo, you'll have an interesting and depressing story to tell your friends and family. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about a couple very different Indigenous experiences and how they are still relevant today. Till next time, this has been the Not So Final Frontier podcast created by History 425 American West at Lewis Clark State College.